Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the treacherous shadows of one of America's most haunting landmarks with 8 disturbing true accounts from the mysterious Skull Cliff region of the Grand Canyon. Each story we explore today has been meticulously documented from the personal testimonies of park rangers, hikers, researchers, and emergency responders who experienced the unexplainable terror that lurks within these ancient stone walls. These are not mere legends passed down through generations, but raw confessions from individuals whose lives were forever changed by what they witnessed in the depths of this cursed canyon territory. From photographers capturing images that should not exist to rescue workers discovering things that defy rational explanation. Tonight we uncover the buried truth about why certain areas of the Grand Canyon remain restricted to the public. To protect the identity and privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, some names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying reality of their encounters. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what lies hidden in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth the next collection of forgotten nightmares. Drop a comment below and tell us about any unexplained experiences you have had in national parks or remote locations. I have been a professional landscape photographer for 15 years, but I have never shown anyone the last photos on my camera from that trip to Skull Cliff. My name is Marcus D'Angelo, and I have traveled across Arizona documenting the raw beauty of our desert landscapes for magazines like Southwest Living and National Geographic. I thought I had seen every angle, every hidden corner of the Grand Canyon region until that assignment in late October changed everything I believed about the places we think we know. The assignment came through my usual contact at Arizona Highways magazine. They wanted a winter feature on the lesser-known areas of the Grand Canyon, specifically focusing on the remote cliff formations that most tourists never see. The pay was excellent, and they gave me complete creative freedom. I had 3 days to capture 20 publishable shots of the Skull Cliff area, a section of the canyon that gets its name from the bone-white limestone formations that jut out like ancient vertebrae along the southern rim. I had researched the area extensively before making the trip. Skull Cliff sits about 40 miles from the main tourist areas, accessible only by a rough dirt road that requires 4-wheel drive and local knowledge to navigate safely. The geological surveys I found mentioned unusual mineral deposits in the rock face that create distinctive color patterns during different lighting conditions. What they did not mention were the strange reports from park rangers about equipment malfunctions and unexplained phenomena in that specific region. I loaded my truck with enough gear for a week-long expedition, even though I only planned to stay 3 days. My equipment included 2 Canon cameras, multiple lenses ranging from wide-angle to telephoto, a heavy-duty tripod, lighting equipment, backup batteries, and enough memory cards to shoot thousands of images. I also packed camping gear, food, water, and emergency supplies because cell phone coverage in that area was non-existent, and help was hours away if something went wrong. The drive to Skull Cliff took nearly 6 hours from Phoenix, with the last 2 hours on increasingly rough terrain that tested both my truck and my determination. When I finally reached my planned campsite, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. The limestone formations really did look like massive skulls emerging from the earth, and I immediately understood why early settlers had given the area such an ominous name. I set up camp quickly and prepared my equipment for the golden hour photography that would begin at dawn. The silence out there was absolute, broken only by occasional wind through the rock formations. I had photographed in remote locations before, but something about Skull Cliff felt different from the moment I arrived. The air seemed thicker somehow, and every sound I made seemed to echo longer than it should have. The first day of shooting went perfectly. I captured stunning images of the sunrise illuminating the cliff face, revealing layers of geological history and the striations of rock. The limestone formations created natural frames for shots of the canyon beyond, and the morning light brought out colors I had never seen in other desert locations. My cameras performed flawlessly, and by noon I had already captured enough quality images to satisfy the magazine assignment. That afternoon I decided to explore deeper into the cliff area to find unique angles for sunset shots. I discovered a narrow ledge about halfway up the main formation that offered an incredible panoramic view of the canyon system. Getting there required some technical climbing, but I had brought rope and safety equipment for exactly these kinds of opportunities. The perspective from that ledge was extraordinary, and I knew the sunset shots would be the highlight of my entire portfolio. As evening approached, I positioned myself on the ledge with my primary camera mounted on the tripod. The light was perfect, and I began shooting as the sun descended toward the horizon. Through my viewfinder, everything looked normal. The canyon spread out below me in all its massive beauty. The rock formations glowed with warm light, and the sky began its transformation through the spectrum of sunset colors. But when I reviewed the images on my camera's display screen, I saw things that had not been visible to my naked eye. In the first few shots, there were dark shapes moving along the canyon floor far below. The shapes were too large to be animals and too organized in their movement to be shadows from passing clouds. They appeared to be human figures, but the scale was wrong. If they were people, they would have had to be at least 12 feet tall to be visible from my position at that distance. I checked my camera settings, thinking I might have accidentally created a double exposure or some other technical error. Everything was correct. I looked down at the canyon floor again, scanning carefully for any sign of movement. I saw nothing but empty desert and rock, but when I took another series of shots and reviewed them immediately, the dark figures were still there, now closer to the base of Skull Cliff directly below my position. The rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe atmospheric conditions were creating some kind of optical illusion that the camera sensor was picking up differently than my eyes. Maybe heat distortion was causing distant objects to appear larger than they actually were. Maybe shadows from the complex rock formations were combining in ways that created the appearance of moving figures. But as I continued shooting, the figures became more distinct and obviously intentional in their movements. They appeared to be climbing up the cliff face below me, though I could see no climbing routes or equipment that would make such an ascent possible. The rock face beneath my ledge was nearly vertical and offered no handholds that I could detect. Yet the dark shapes continued upward, growing larger in each successive photograph. I switched to my telephoto lens to get a closer look at whatever was creating these images. When I zoomed in on the area where the figures appeared to be, I saw details that made my hands shake. The shapes had human-like forms but wrong proportions. Their limbs were too long, their torsos too narrow, and their movements too fluid for normal human anatomy. They climbed the cliff face like spiders, clinging to surfaces that should not have supported any weight. The sun was almost completely set by this point, but I continued taking photographs compulsively. Each image showed the figures getting closer to my position. In the growing darkness, I could finally see them with my own eyes as they approached. They were not human, though they had once been human-shaped. Their skin was the same bone-white color as the limestone cliffs, and their eyes reflected the last rays of sunlight like an animal's eyes in headlights. I had no rational explanation for what I was witnessing. These beings, whatever they were, existed in a way that my camera could detect before my eyes could see them clearly. They moved with purpose and intelligence, and they were definitely climbing toward my ledge. I packed my equipment as quickly as possible, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my primary camera twice. The rappel down from the ledge was the most terrifying few minutes of my life. I could hear movement on the rock face around me, the sound of fingernails or claws scraping against stone. But every time I looked toward the sounds, I saw nothing but empty cliff face. My camera, hanging from its strap around my neck, continued to fire automatically as I descended, the flash illuminating the darkness in brief bursts. I reached the bottom of the cliff and ran toward my campsite without looking back. My equipment was scattered and disorganized as I threw everything into my truck, but I did not care about organization or proper packing procedures. I just wanted to get away from Skull Cliff as quickly as possible. The drive back to the main road took place in complete darkness, and I stopped frequently to check my mirrors for signs of pursuit, though I had no idea what I was expecting to see. When I reached civilization and reviewed all the photographs from that evening, I found a complete visual record of my encounter. The images showed the pale beings climbing steadily upward through the growing darkness. The final photographs, taken automatically as I rappelled down, showed dozens of them emerging from cracks and crevices all along the cliff face. They had been watching me the entire time I was up there. I never submitted those photographs to Arizona Highways magazine. Instead, I sent them a selection of the normal landscape shots from earlier in the day and made up a story about equipment problems that prevented me from getting the sunset shots they had requested. The editor was disappointed but accepted the daytime images, which were technically excellent and met their needs for the article. I have never returned to Skull Cliff, and I have never photographed in any remote area of the Grand Canyon region since that trip. The camera that captured those images is locked in a safe deposit box along with the memory cards containing the full sequence of photographs. I know that someday someone will find them and wonder what they are looking at, but I hope that day does not come for many years. The experience changed my entire relationship with photography and with the natural world. I realized that my cameras were capable of seeing things that remained invisible to human perception, and I was not prepared for that level of reality. There are places in this world where the boundary between what we think we know and what actually exists becomes dangerously thin. I still work as a photographer, but now I specialize in urban architecture and commercial photography. I take assignments that keep me in populated areas where strange encounters are unlikely and where help is always nearby if something goes wrong. My colleagues think I burned out on landscape photography or lost my passion for the wilderness, but the truth is much more complicated than professional burnout. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about those pale beings climbing steadily up the cliff face toward my position. I wonder if they are still there, waiting in the cracks and shadows of Skull Cliff for the next photographer or hiker who ventures too far from the established trails. I wonder if my presence there awakened something that had been sleeping in the limestone depths, or if I simply became aware of something that has always been active in that remote corner of the Grand Canyon. What disturbs me most is not knowing whether my camera revealed something that was actually there, or whether the act of photographing that location somehow created the very phenomena I documented. Modern digital cameras are incredibly sophisticated instruments capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation across a broader spectrum than human eyes can perceive. It is possible that my equipment was recording entities that exist in wavelengths of light invisible to normal human vision. But it is also possible that the repeated act of photographing that location created some kind of resonance or disturbance that attracted attention from things that normally remain hidden. Indigenous peoples throughout the Southwest have traditional stories about places where the spirits of the earth should not be disturbed by modern technology. And I have begun to wonder if I stumbled into one of those sacred and dangerous locations. The photographs remain locked away, serving as evidence of an encounter I never intended to have and can never fully explain. They are too clear and detailed to dismiss as technical malfunctions, too consistent across multiple images to explain as coincidental shadows or optical illusions. They document something that challenged everything I thought I understood about the natural world and about the limitations of human perception. I have told this story to no one until now, and I expect that most people will find it difficult to believe. But I know what I saw through my viewfinder that evening at Skull Cliff. And I know what my cameras recorded during those terrifying hours. There are places in this world where our technology reveals more than we are prepared to understand, and sometimes the truth is more disturbing than any fiction we could imagine. I volunteer for Grand Canyon Search and Rescue because I believe everyone deserves to come home. But some people at Skull Cliff do not want to be found. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been part of the Coconino County Search and Rescue Team for 8 years. I have participated in over 200 rescue operations throughout Arizona, from flash flood evacuations to technical rope rescues on vertical cliff faces. But the mission that took place at Skull Cliff last January changed my understanding of what we are really searching for when people disappear in the wilderness. The initial call came through our emergency dispatch system at approximately 4 in the morning on a Tuesday. 2 separate groups of hikers had reported seeing distress signals from the Skull Cliff area the previous evening, including what appeared to be flashlight signals in a pattern that indicated someone was trying to communicate for help. The signals had been observed between 8 and 10 o'clock at night, coming from a location high on the cliff face that should not have been accessible to recreational hikers without specialized climbing equipment. Our team leader, Captain Sarah Mitchell, assembled a full technical rescue squad consisting of 6 experienced volunteers and 2 professional paramedics. The terrain at Skull Cliff requires advanced rope work and high-angle rescue techniques, so we loaded our vehicles with complete climbing systems, medical equipment, communications gear, and enough supplies for an extended operation. The weather forecast called for clear conditions with temperatures dropping below freezing after sunset, which meant that anyone stranded on the cliff face would be facing life-threatening exposure. The drive to Skull Cliff took nearly 3 hours because we had to transport heavy rescue equipment over rough terrain that tested the limits of our 4-wheel drive vehicles. We established our base camp at the bottom of the main cliff formation and began our assessment of the rescue situation using binoculars and telephoto cameras to scan the cliff face for signs of stranded hikers. The limestone cliffs rose nearly 400 feet above us with multiple ledges and fractures that could potentially shelter someone who had become trapped during a climbing attempt. Using our high-powered spotlights and electronic megaphones, we attempted to make contact with anyone who might be on the cliff face. We followed standard search and rescue protocols, calling out at regular intervals and listening for responses that would help us locate the position of anyone requiring assistance. The echoes from our voices bounced off the limestone walls in complex patterns that made it difficult to determine the direction of any potential responses. But we thought we heard faint calls for help coming from somewhere high on the cliff face. Captain Mitchell deployed our technical climbing team to begin ascending the cliff face using established anchor points and safety systems. I was part of the advance team that would locate and assess the condition of any stranded hikers before the paramedics and additional rescue personnel were brought up to provide medical assistance and evacuation support. The climb to the first major ledge system took nearly 2 hours because we had to place protection anchors and establish safe belay stations as we ascended. When we reached the first ledge, approximately 150 feet up the cliff face, we found evidence that people had recently been in that location. There were scuff marks on the rock surface that indicated foot traffic, and we discovered several pieces of climbing equipment, including carabiners, webbing, and a partially used rope that appeared to have been cut rather than broken under load. The equipment was standard climbing gear, but it had been abandoned in a way that suggested emergency or panic rather than planned retreat. But there were no people on the ledge and no obvious signs of injury or distress that would explain why climbing equipment had been left behind. We used our radio communications to report our findings to the base camp team and continued our ascent toward the higher ledge systems where the distress signals had been observed. The limestone rock was solid and offered good handholds, but the exposure was significant, and the consequences of a fall would be fatal. As we climbed higher on the cliff face, we began to notice unusual characteristics in the rock formations that did not match the geological descriptions in our area maps. There were cavities and openings in the limestone that appeared to be natural caves or passages extending deep into the cliff structure. Some of these openings were large enough for human passage, and they showed evidence of recent use, including footprints in the accumulated dust and debris. The most significant discovery came when we reached the main ledge system approximately 250 feet above the canyon floor. We found a complete campsite including sleeping bags, backpacks, food supplies, and personal belongings that clearly belonged to multiple people. But the campsite appeared to have been abandoned hastily, with gear scattered and personal items left behind in ways that indicated sudden departure rather than planned evacuation. Among the abandoned belongings, we found identification documents belonging to 3 different individuals: Michael Torres from Phoenix, Jennifer Adams from Flagstaff, and Robert Kim from Tucson. According to the dates on their permits and camping receipts, these individuals had been in the area for at least 4 days, which meant they had been camping on the cliff ledge much longer than would be safe or legal without proper permits for extended stays in wilderness areas. But the most disturbing aspect of the campsite discovery was that the sleeping bags and personal belongings showed no signs of struggle or violence, yet the occupants had clearly left in extreme haste. Food was still in cooking pots, personal hygiene items were scattered as if people had been interrupted during normal camp activities, and valuable equipment, including expensive cameras and GPS devices, had been left behind. No experienced backpacker would abandon such equipment unless facing immediate life-threatening danger. We used our radio communications to relay the names and identification information to our base camp team for verification with missing persons databases and Park Service records. While waiting for that information, we continued our search of the ledge area and discovered something that made no sense within the context of a normal rescue operation. We found additional climbing equipment and personal belongings that appeared to belong to different groups of people from different time periods. Some of the abandoned gear showed signs of extended weathering and appeared to have been on the ledge for months or possibly years. There were pieces of clothing, camping equipment, and personal items that represented multiple separate groups of hikers or climbers who had apparently reached this same ledge and then disappeared, leaving their belongings behind. The accumulation of abandoned equipment suggested a pattern of disappearances that had been occurring over an extended period. Captain Mitchell joined our advance team on the ledge and immediately recognized that we were dealing with something far more complex than a routine rescue operation. The evidence suggested multiple groups of missing persons rather than a single emergency, and the pattern of abandoned equipment indicated that people had been reaching this location and then vanishing without explanation. She made the decision to expand our search into the cave openings and passages that we had discovered in the cliff face. The largest cave opening was located at the back of the main ledge and extended horizontally into the limestone cliff for an unknown distance. Using our headlamps and flashlights, we could see that the passage continued beyond the range of our lights and appeared to be a natural tunnel system within the cliff structure. There were definite signs that people had entered this cave system, including footprints, rope marks on the cave walls, and pieces of climbing equipment scattered along the entrance passage. Against standard search and rescue protocols, I volunteered to enter the cave system to search for the missing hikers. Captain Mitchell was reluctant to approve cave exploration without proper spelunking equipment and additional safety personnel, but the evidence clearly indicated that the missing people had gone into the cave passages, and we had an obligation to attempt rescue if they were trapped underground. The cave passage extended much deeper into the cliff than our preliminary examination had suggested. After crawling and climbing through the limestone tunnel for approximately 100 yards, I emerged into a large underground chamber that appeared to be a natural cavern within the cliff structure. My flashlight illuminated a space that was roughly the size of a small auditorium, with a high ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of my light beam. But the most shocking discovery in the underground chamber was that it contained evidence of long-term human habitation. There were sleeping areas, food storage, water collection systems, and personal belongings that indicated multiple people had been living in the cave for extended periods. The sleeping areas appeared to be occupied, with personal belongings arranged as if the inhabitants had stepped away temporarily and intended to return. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the personal belongings in the cave matched the identification documents we had found in the abandoned campsite on the ledge. Michael Torres, Jennifer Adams, and Robert Kim appeared to have been living in the underground chamber, along with several other individuals whose belongings suggested they had been there much longer. There were personal items dating back months or possibly years, indicating a community of people who had chosen or been compelled to remain in the cave system. But there were no people in the underground chamber when I explored it. The sleeping areas appeared recently used, food supplies were fresh, and there were signs of ongoing habitation, but the cave was completely empty of human occupants. It was as if an entire community of people had suddenly vanished from their underground refuge, leaving behind all their possessions and survival infrastructure. Using my radio communications, I reported the cave discoveries to Captain Mitchell and requested additional team members to help with the expanded search operation. But as I was preparing to return through the cave passage to the main ledge, I heard sounds that indicated people moving deeper within the cave system. There were voices echoing from passages that led further into the cliff structure, and the voices seemed to be calling for help or trying to communicate. I made the decision to investigate the source of the voices, following additional cave passages that led deeper into the limestone cliff. The passages were narrow and required technical climbing skills to navigate safely, but I could hear the voices becoming clearer as I moved deeper into the cave system. The voices were definitely human, and they seemed to be calling specific names, including some that matched the identification documents we had discovered. But as I got closer to the source of the voices, I began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was hearing. The voices were calling for help and trying to communicate, but they were also repeating the same phrases and names in patterns that seemed artificial or recorded. The voices lacked the emotional variation and spontaneous quality of people genuinely calling for help, and they seemed designed to lure searchers deeper into the cave system. When I finally reached the area where the voices seemed to originate, I found another large underground chamber that contained no people at all. The voices continued to echo through the space, but there was no source for the sounds that I could identify. The chamber contained more evidence of human habitation, including fresh food supplies and recently used sleeping areas, but it was completely empty of actual human occupants. At that point, I made the decision to retreat immediately back toward the cave entrance and rejoin the main rescue team. But as I was navigating back through the cave passages, I heard new voices behind me that seemed to be following my progress through the tunnel system. The voices were calling my name and asking me to wait or come back. But I had never introduced myself to anyone in the caves, and there was no way that anyone I had not encountered could know my identity. I emerged from the cave system onto the main ledge where Captain Mitchell and the rest of the rescue team were waiting for my report. When I described what I had found in the underground chambers, the team made the immediate decision to evacuate from the cliff face and return to base camp. The evidence we had discovered indicated a situation that exceeded the scope of normal search and rescue operations and required investigation by law enforcement and Park Service authorities. The official incident report documented the discovery of abandoned equipment and evidence of missing persons, but it did not include detailed descriptions of the underground chambers or the community infrastructure we had found in the cave system. The case was referred to the National Park Service for investigation as potential missing persons cases, and the Skull Cliff area was temporarily restricted to prevent additional hikers from accessing the dangerous cliff face. But over the following months, I began to experience persistent dreams and intrusive thoughts related to the voices I had heard in the cave system. The voices seemed to be calling for me to return to the underground chambers, and they provided detailed information about passages and locations within the cave system that I had not fully explored during my initial search. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that I began to question whether my experience in the caves had been entirely real. 6 months after the rescue operation, I learned that 2 other members of our search team had requested transfers to different rescue units and had stopped participating in operations at remote wilderness locations. When I contacted them privately, they admitted to experiencing similar dreams and intrusive thoughts related to the voices from the Skull Cliff caves, and they expressed concerns about the psychological effects of our experience during the rescue operation. I have not returned to Skull Cliff since that January rescue mission, and I now limit my search and rescue activities to locations that do not involve cave systems or underground exploration. The evidence we discovered during that operation suggested that people who disappear in the wilderness do not always want to be found, and that some missing persons cases involve circumstances that fall outside our understanding of normal human behavior. The voices I heard in those limestone caves were calling for help, but they were also calling for something else that I did not understand and did not want to investigate further. There are places in the wilderness where search and rescue operations become something more dangerous than emergency response, and Skull Cliff appears to be one of those places where the people we are searching for may not be the people we ultimately find. Our professor always warned us about staying on designated paths during field studies, but when we found those bone fragments embedded in the cliff face, scientific curiosity overrode common sense. My name is Benjamin Rivera, and I am a graduate student in geological sciences at the University of Arizona. What happened during our field trip to Skull Cliff in December has changed my entire understanding of what lies beneath the surface of our planet, and why some discoveries should remain buried in the depths where they have rested for millennia. The field trip was part of our advanced stratigraphy course, led by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who has been studying Grand Canyon geology for over 30 years. Our group consisted of 6 graduate students and 2 undergraduate geology majors who had earned spots through exceptional academic performance. The purpose of our expedition was to conduct hands-on analysis of the limestone formations at Skull Cliff examining mineral deposits and sedimentary layers that represent millions of years of geological history. We were specifically tasked with collecting samples for laboratory analysis and documenting the stratigraphic sequence of the cliff face. Dr. Hendricks had chosen the Skull Cliff location because it offered an excellent cross-section of Paleozoic limestone formations that are not easily accessible at other Grand Canyon sites. The cliff face displays clear boundaries between different geological periods, with fossil evidence embedded in the rock layers that tell the story of ancient marine environments. Our assignment required us to identify and document at least 12 distinct sedimentary layers, collect samples from each layer, and analyze the mineral composition using portable field equipment. We arrived at the base camp area on a Thursday morning in mid-December, when the desert air was cold enough to require heavy jackets but clear enough to provide excellent visibility for our work. Dr. Hendricks established strict safety protocols for our cliff face examination, including buddy system requirements, time limits for individual exploration, and mandatory check-ins every 2 hours. She emphasized repeatedly that graduate research was not worth risking life or limb, and that any samples we could not safely collect would have to be left for future expeditions with more specialized equipment. The limestone cliff face at Skull Cliff rises nearly 400 feet from the canyon floor, with natural ledges and fractures that make it possible to examine different geological layers without technical climbing equipment. The rock is predominantly white and gray limestone with distinctive red and orange mineral staining from iron oxide deposits. What makes this location particularly valuable for geological study is the exceptional preservation of fossil specimens and the clear delineation between different sedimentary periods that occurred when this region was covered by ancient seas. My specific assignment focused on the middle section of the cliff face, approximately 150 feet above the canyon floor, where Permian limestone formations transition into Triassic sandstone layers. This boundary represents one of the most significant geological transitions in Grand Canyon stratigraphy, marking the end of the Paleozoic era and the beginning of the Mesozoic era. I was responsible for documenting this transition zone and collecting samples that would allow us to analyze the environmental conditions during this crucial period in Earth's history. On the second day of our fieldwork, while examining the Permian limestone layer at approximately noon when the lighting conditions were optimal, I noticed something unusual embedded in the rock face that did not match any of the typical marine fossils we expected to find in this formation. The object appeared to be bone fragments, but they were much larger than any known marine organism from the Permian period, and showed characteristics that seemed inconsistent with the geological age of the surrounding rock. The bone fragments were partially exposed in a natural crack in the limestone, appearing to be the remains of some type of vertebrate organism. But according to our geological knowledge, terrestrial vertebrates of the size indicated by these bone fragments should not exist in Permian marine limestone formations. The bones were too large to belong to fish or marine reptiles from that period, and they showed structural characteristics that suggested an adaptation to terrestrial rather than aquatic environments. I called over my field partner, Jessica Martinez, who was working on adjacent sections of the cliff face. Jessica has extensive experience with paleontological specimens from her undergraduate work at the Museum of Natural History, and I wanted her professional opinion before documenting what appeared to be an anomalous discovery. When she examined the bone fragments through our field magnifying equipment, her reaction was immediate concern rather than excitement about a potential significant find. The bone fragments appeared to be humanoid in structure, but scaled to a size that would indicate an individual of extraordinary height and bone density. The femur fragment that was most clearly visible suggested a being that would have stood at least 9 or 10 feet tall when alive, with bone thickness that exceeded normal human proportions by a significant margin. More disturbing was the apparent age of the bones, which seemed to be contemporaneous with the limestone formation rather than a later intrusion into older rock. Jessica and I spent the remainder of that afternoon carefully photographing and documenting the bone fragments without attempting to extract them from the limestone matrix. Our field protocols required that any unusual discoveries be reported to Dr. Hendricks before any collection or removal attempts were made. We used our GPS equipment to record the exact coordinates of the find and took detailed photographs from multiple angles with measurement scales to document the size and position of the visible bone fragments. When we reported our discovery to Dr. Hendricks that evening during our group debriefing session, her reaction was unexpectedly negative. Instead of the scientific excitement we anticipated, she became visibly uncomfortable and insisted that we had misidentified marine reptile fossils or perhaps encountered bones from a much more recent intrusion into the older limestone. She refused to examine our photographs in detail and ordered us to focus our remaining fieldwork on other sections of the cliff face. But Jessica and I could not simply dismiss what we had documented. The bone fragments were clearly visible and photographically documented, and our geological training allowed us to distinguish between different types of fossilized remains. These were definitely not marine reptile fossils, and they showed no evidence of being recent intrusions into older rock formations. The bones appeared to be genuinely ancient and genuinely anomalous for their geological context. The following morning, Jessica and I returned to the location of our discovery before the official start of our scheduled fieldwork. We wanted to conduct more detailed examination and potentially collect small samples that would allow for laboratory analysis without compromising the overall specimen. Our plan was to gather enough evidence to support our initial observations and present a compelling case to Dr. Hendricks for official documentation of the find. When we reached the location where we had found the bone fragments the previous day, we discovered that the natural crack in the limestone had been significantly enlarged, apparently by recent fracturing or weathering. More bone fragments were now visible, including what appeared to be portions of a skull that showed both human and non-human characteristics. The cranial capacity suggested intelligence comparable to modern humans, but the overall bone structure was unlike any known hominin species from the fossil record. As we documented these newly exposed specimens, we began to notice other anomalous features in the surrounding limestone. There were carved markings or symbols embedded in the rock face near the bone fragments, appearing to be deliberate engravings rather than natural geological features. The symbols were geometric in nature and showed evidence of being created with tools, but they were clearly ancient and integrated into the limestone formation rather than being recent additions to the rock surface. The most disturbing discovery came when we used our portable ground-penetrating radar equipment to examine the cliff face behind the visible bone fragments. The radar signatures indicated a much larger skeletal structure extending deep into the limestone, suggesting that what we could see was only a small portion of a complete specimen. The radar data showed bone structures continuing for several meters into the rock face, indicating a discovery of potentially enormous scientific significance. But as we continued our unauthorized examination, we began to experience equipment malfunctions that we could not explain through normal technical problems. Our digital cameras began producing images with strange distortions and color anomalies that occurred only when photographing the bone fragments and surrounding symbols. Our GPS unit started giving inconsistent coordinate readings, and our portable radio communications with the base camp became filled with static and interference. More concerning were the physical sensations we began experiencing during our extended exposure to the discovery site. Both Jessica and I reported feeling disoriented and nauseous after spending more than an hour in close proximity to the bone fragments. We experienced difficulty concentrating and found ourselves making basic errors in our documentation procedures that we would never normally make during field work. There was also a persistent sense of being observed or watched, even though we were alone on the cliff face. When we finally returned to base camp and reported our expanded findings to Dr. Hendricks, her reaction was swift and decisive. She immediately ordered the termination of all fieldwork at the Skull Cliff site and began preparations for immediate departure. She confiscated all of our photographic equipment and documentation materials, claiming that they were needed for official review by the university administration. She also made us sign non-disclosure agreements regarding any unusual discoveries made during the field trip. The official explanation provided to the other students was that safety concerns and weather predictions necessitated an early end to the field trip. Dr. Hendricks announced that our remaining assignments would be completed using geological samples from other locations and that the Skull Cliff site would not be used for future fieldwork due to unstable rock conditions and access difficulties. She emphasized that any student discussion of unauthorized discoveries or speculation about unusual findings would result in academic discipline and potential removal from the graduate program. During our return journey to the university, Jessica and I had an opportunity to discuss our experience privately. We both agreed that our discoveries at Skull Cliff represented something far more significant than normal paleontological specimens, and that Dr. Hendricks' reaction suggested she was aware of similar findings or had been specifically instructed to prevent students from making such discoveries. The non-disclosure agreements and confiscation of our documentation materials indicated institutional knowledge of phenomena that were being actively suppressed. Over the following weeks, Jessica and I attempted to research similar discoveries at other Grand Canyon geological sites, but we found that access to relevant scientific literature was restricted, and that several research papers we attempted to locate had been removed from university databases. Our attempts to contact other geology students who had previously studied at Skull Cliff were unsuccessful, and we learned that the site had been used for student fieldwork only intermittently over the past decade. 3 months after our field trip, Jessica received notification that her graduate fellowship had been terminated due to budget constraints, and she was forced to leave the university program. I received a similar notification 2 weeks later, effectively ending both of our academic careers in geological sciences. Dr. Hendricks avoided all contact with us after our return from Skull Cliff, and our requests for meetings or explanations were referred to university administration officials who claimed no knowledge of our concerns. I have since changed my academic focus to engineering and have not returned to geological fieldwork. Jessica moved to another state and now works in environmental consulting. We maintain occasional contact, but neither of us has attempted to publicize or pursue our discoveries at Skull Cliff. The non-disclosure agreements we signed carry significant legal penalties, and we have no desire to face institutional retaliation or professional consequences for discussing our experience. But I know what we found embedded in that limestone cliff face, and I know that it challenges fundamental assumptions about the geological and archaeological record of the Grand Canyon region. The bone fragments we documented belong to beings that should not have existed during the Permian period according to conventional scientific understanding, and the symbols carved into the rock face suggested technological capabilities that predate known human civilization by millions of years. There are discoveries waiting beneath the surface of our planet that would revolutionize our understanding of history and evolution, but there are also institutional forces committed to ensuring that such discoveries remain buried. The limestone cliffs of the Grand Canyon contain evidence of ancient civilizations and unknown species that existed long before conventional science believed such things were possible. And I suspect that our discovery at Skull Cliff was not unique or unprecedented. The bone fragments are still there, embedded in the limestone cliff face, waiting for the next group of students or researchers who venture into areas they are not supposed to explore. But I doubt that future discoveries will be treated any differently than ours were, and I suspect that the truth about what lies beneath the surface of Skull Cliff will continue to be suppressed by those who have the authority to control access to such information. After 23 years as a Grand Canyon park ranger, I thought I had seen every type of emergency call possible until I got the radio transmission from Skull Cliff sector on November 15th. My name is Linda Mae Patterson, and I have worked for the National Park Service since I graduated from Northern Arizona University with a degree in environmental science. During my career, I have responded to everything from routine medical emergencies to search and rescue operations for missing hikers. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened that cold Tuesday morning when the call came through about the missing research team. The transmission came from Ranger Station 7, which monitors the remote southeastern sections of the park, including the Skull Cliff area. The voice on the radio belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, a newer ranger who had been stationed there for only 6 months. His voice was shaking when he reported that a geological research team from Arizona State University had failed to check in at their scheduled time, and their emergency beacon had been activated but was transmitting from a location that should not have been accessible to anyone on foot. I was the senior ranger on duty that morning, so the responsibility for coordinating the response fell to me. The missing team consisted of 3 graduate students and their faculty advisor, Dr. Margaret Chen, who were conducting a week-long study of mineral deposits in the Skull Cliff limestone formations. They had proper permits for the research area and were experienced in desert survival and technical climbing. Their last confirmed contact had been at 8 o'clock the previous evening when they radioed in their location and confirmed that all team members were present and accounted for. The emergency beacon signal was coming from approximately 2 miles deeper into the canyon than their reported position, in an area that our topographical maps showed as impassable vertical cliff face. There were no established trails or climbing routes that would have allowed the team to reach the beacon's coordinates, and the terrain was considered too dangerous for recreational access. The signal was strong and consistent, indicating that the beacon was functioning properly and had not been damaged or compromised. I assembled a search and rescue team consisting of 4 experienced rangers and 2 volunteer climbers who had extensive knowledge of the Skull Cliff area. We loaded our vehicles with technical rescue equipment, medical supplies, and enough food and water for an extended operation. The drive to the remote access point took nearly 2 hours over rough terrain, and we began our approach to the beacon coordinates on foot at approximately noon. The hike to the general area took another 3 hours because we had to navigate around several sections of unstable rock and loose scree. As we got closer to the beacon signal, the terrain became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The limestone cliffs rose nearly vertical on all sides, and the only way forward was through a narrow canyon that seemed to dead end against the main cliff face. Our GPS units confirmed that we were approaching the beacon coordinates, but visually we could see no way for anyone to have reached this location. When we finally located the source of the emergency signal, we found the beacon device sitting on a narrow ledge approximately 100 feet up the main cliff face. There was no climbing equipment visible, no ropes or anchors that would have enabled someone to reach that ledge, and no obvious route up or down from the position. The beacon was simply sitting there alone, transmitting its distress signal into the empty desert air. More disturbing was the fact that the ledge appeared to be completely inaccessible from any direction we could determine. We used binoculars and telephoto camera lenses to examine the ledge and surrounding area in detail. The beacon was definitely the one assigned to Dr. Chen's research team, but there were no other signs of human presence on the ledge or anywhere in the immediate vicinity. No backpacks, no climbing gear, no personal belongings that would indicate the team had been in that location. The beacon appeared to have been placed deliberately in a position where it would be visible but not retrievable without specialized high-angle rescue equipment. One of our volunteer climbers, Sarah Mitchell, who had been climbing in the Grand Canyon region for over 15 years, examined the cliff face with professional climbing equipment and determined that reaching the ledge would require technical gear and skills that exceeded what a geological research team would normally carry. The rock face offered no natural handholds or footholds, and the limestone was too soft and fractured to support traditional climbing anchors. Even with proper equipment, the ascent would be extremely dangerous and would require multiple experienced climbers working together. We spent the remainder of that day searching the canyon floor and surrounding areas for any signs of the missing team. We found their base camp exactly where their permits indicated it should be, with all equipment still in place and no signs of disturbance or hasty departure. Their research notes were neatly organized, their food supplies were untouched, and their sleeping bags appeared to have been slept in the previous night. Everything suggested that they had simply vanished sometime between their evening radio check and the following morning when they failed to report in. The search continued for 6 more days with additional resources brought in from other Park Service units and local law enforcement agencies. We expanded the search radius to include areas that would have required the team to travel much farther than their research objectives would have necessitated. Helicopters conducted aerial surveys of the entire region, and ground teams covered every accessible square mile within reasonable walking distance of their base camp. We found no traces of the missing researchers anywhere in the expanded search area. On the 4th day of the search, we finally retrieved the emergency beacon from the cliff ledge using helicopter and technical rope rescue specialists. The device was examined by our communications technician and found to be functioning normally with no signs of damage or tampering. The activation log showed that the beacon had been turned on manually at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, several hours after the team's last radio contact. The manual activation meant that someone had deliberately triggered the emergency signal rather than it being activated automatically by impact or water damage. What disturbed me most about the beacon retrieval was something that our helicopter pilot mentioned during the debriefing. He reported that while hovering near the cliff face, his aircraft had experienced unusual electromagnetic interference that affected both his navigation equipment and radio communications. The interference was localized to the immediate area around the ledge where the beacon was found, and it cleared up completely once he moved the helicopter away from that specific location. He had never experienced similar interference during thousands of hours of flying in the Grand Canyon region. The official investigation concluded that the research team had somehow become disoriented and wandered away from their base camp, possibly during the night hours when visibility would have been limited. The theory suggested that they had fallen victim to exposure or accident in a remote area that had not yet been searched, and that the emergency beacon had been activated and thrown or carried to the cliff ledge by unknown means, possibly wind or wildlife. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation with no evidence of foul play, but there were aspects of the case that the official report did not adequately address. The team consisted of experienced researchers who were familiar with desert survival and navigation techniques. They carried GPS devices, emergency whistles, and other safety equipment that should have prevented them from becoming lost in familiar terrain. The condition of their base camp suggested a planned and organized departure rather than a panicked flight or emergency evacuation. Most significantly, the placement of the emergency beacon in an inaccessible location suggested deliberate human action rather than accidental loss or natural forces. Someone had to have placed that device on the cliff ledge, but our investigation found no evidence that anyone with the necessary climbing skills had been in the area during the relevant time period. The electromagnetic interference reported by our helicopter pilot also suggested unusual environmental factors that we could not explain through normal geological or atmospheric phenomena. 6 months after the disappearance, I received an unofficial report from a colleague at Ranger Station 7 that Tommy Rodriguez had requested a transfer to a different park assignment. When I contacted Tommy directly, he told me that he had been experiencing recurring nightmares about voices calling for help from the Skull Cliff area, particularly during the overnight shifts when he was alone at the remote station. He said that the voices seemed to come from the direction of the cliff face where we had found the emergency beacon, and that they occurred most frequently around 3 o'clock in the morning, which was the same time the beacon activation had been logged. I have never filed an official report about Tommy's experiences because they fall outside the scope of normal Park Service documentation. But his account troubled me enough that I began conducting my own unofficial monitoring of the Skull Cliff area during overnight patrols. Over the following months, I made several solo visits to the location where we had found the research team's base camp, usually during the early morning hours when the desert is at its quietest. On 3 separate occasions, I heard sounds that seemed to originate from the cliff face area where the emergency beacon had been recovered. The sounds were difficult to describe precisely, but they resembled human voices calling for help or assistance. The voices were too distant and distorted to make out specific words, but the tone and rhythm suggested people in distress trying to communicate across a great distance. Each time I investigated these sounds with flashlights and binoculars, I found no visual evidence of human presence in the area. The case of Dr. Chen's research team remains officially unsolved, and no trace of the 4 missing researchers has ever been found despite extensive searches and ongoing investigations. The Skull Cliff area has been temporarily restricted to scientific research requiring special permits, and routine patrol coverage of that sector has been reduced due to budget constraints and personnel reassignments. The official explanation for these administrative changes relates to budget priorities and resource allocation, but I suspect that other factors may have influenced the decision to limit Park Service presence in that particular area. I am scheduled to retire from the National Park Service next year after completing my 24th year of service. The missing research team case will probably remain open indefinitely, joining the dozens of other unsolved disappearances that occur in national parks across the country each year. But I know that something happened to those 4 people in the Skull Cliff area that cannot be explained by the standard theories about getting lost or falling victim to natural hazards. The emergency beacon placement, the electromagnetic interference, and the ongoing reports of voices in the night all point to phenomena that fall outside our normal understanding of missing persons cases in wilderness areas. There are places in the Grand Canyon where the combination of geological history, isolation, and unknown environmental factors creates conditions that we do not fully comprehend. And I believe that Skull Cliff is one of those places where our conventional explanations prove inadequate. We came to film a documentary about Grand Canyon legends, but our camera operator started recording things that were not there during our last shoot at Skull Cliff. My name is Jasmine Washington, and I work as a producer for independent documentary films based out of Las Vegas. Our production company specializes in paranormal and unexplained phenomena content for streaming platforms and cable television networks. The project that brought us to Skull Cliff was supposed to be a straightforward exploration of Native American legends and geological mysteries. But it became something far more disturbing than any of us were prepared to handle. The documentary concept originated from research conducted by our director Marcus Chen, who had been studying reports of unusual phenomena in remote areas of the Grand Canyon for over 2 years. Our initial proposal focused on indigenous folklore about spiritual boundaries and sacred sites that should not be disturbed by modern visitors. The network executives were interested in the project because it combined historical research with contemporary mystery elements, and they approved funding for a 5-day shoot at various locations throughout the canyon region. Our crew consisted of 6 people, including myself as producer, Marcus as director, Sarah Mitchell as our primary camera operator, Robert Kim as sound engineer, Jennifer Adams as research coordinator, and Michael Torres as our local guide and safety coordinator. We had extensive experience filming in remote wilderness locations, and we carried professional-grade equipment including multiple cameras, sound recording systems, drone technology for aerial shots, and satellite communication devices for emergency situations. The first 3 days of filming went according to our planned schedule. We documented several well-known legend sites and conducted interviews with tribal elders and Park Service personnel who were willing to discuss the folklore and historical accounts associated with different areas of the Grand Canyon. Our footage was excellent quality, and we were capturing exactly the type of content that our network contacts had requested for the documentary series. Skull Cliff was scheduled as our final location because Marcus wanted to end the documentary with the most visually dramatic and mysterious site we could access within our budget and time constraints. The limestone cliff formations provided an excellent backdrop for our concluding segment about the boundaries between scientific explanation and unexplained phenomena. We planned to spend our final day filming establishing shots, conducting our last interviews, and capturing sunset footage that would serve as the closing sequence for the documentary. We arrived at Skull Cliff early on Thursday morning and began setting up our equipment for a full day of filming. Sarah positioned her primary camera system on a stable tripod to capture wide shots of the cliff face, while Robert established his sound recording equipment to document both our narration and the natural acoustics of the canyon environment. The weather conditions were perfect for filming, with clear skies and excellent visibility that would allow us to capture the limestone formations in optimal lighting. The first unusual incident occurred around 10 o'clock in the morning when Sarah was filming establishing shots of the cliff face through her telephoto lens. She reported seeing movement on the cliff face that appeared to be people climbing on areas that should have been inaccessible to human passage. When we examined the cliff face directly with binoculars, we could see no signs of climbers or any equipment that would enable such an ascent. But Sarah insisted that her camera was recording human figures moving across the limestone walls. We reviewed the footage immediately using Sarah's camera display screen, and we could clearly see dark shapes moving along the cliff face in patterns that suggested deliberate climbing rather than shadows or optical illusions. The shapes appeared to be human in form, but scaled to a size that would indicate individuals of extraordinary height and apparent ability to cling to vertical rock surfaces. The footage was technically perfect, with no signs of camera malfunction or recording errors. Robert began experiencing audio recording problems around the same time that Sarah was documenting the visual anomalies. His professional sound equipment was picking up voices and conversations that none of us could hear directly. The recorded voices seemed to be speaking in multiple languages, including what sounded like indigenous dialects, but also languages that Robert could not identify despite his extensive experience with international documentary projects. The voices appeared to be having conversations about our presence and our filming activities. Marcus made the decision to continue filming while documenting these unusual phenomena as part of our documentary content. We had been hired to investigate unexplained occurrences at Grand Canyon locations, and we were clearly encountering exactly the type of material that would make our documentary compelling and authentic. We began treating the anomalous footage and audio recordings as legitimate documentation of paranormal activity rather than technical problems with our equipment. But as the day progressed, the phenomena became increasingly intense and difficult to explain through equipment malfunctions or environmental factors. Sarah's camera began recording multiple exposure effects that showed the same locations at what appeared to be different time periods simultaneously. The cliff face would appear in her footage, showing both its current state and what looked like the same location during different historical periods, with evidence of human activity spanning what appeared to be decades or centuries. The most disturbing development came when Sarah's camera began recording people and activities that were clearly not present at our filming location. The footage showed individuals in period clothing from different historical eras, including what appeared to be Native American ceremonies, early European explorers, and groups of people in clothing from various decades of the 20th century. All of these people appeared to be occupying the same physical space as our contemporary filming location, but existing in what seemed to be different time periods. Robert's audio equipment was simultaneously recording conversations and activities that corresponded to the visual anomalies that Sarah was documenting. We could hear voices discussing events and referencing technologies from different historical periods, including conversations that seemed to be occurring in the present day but involving people who were not physically present at our location. The audio quality was excellent and showed no signs of interference or external radio transmissions. By afternoon, our entire crew was experiencing disorientation and difficulty maintaining focus on our planned filming schedule. The combination of visual and audio phenomena was creating a psychological impact that made it difficult to distinguish between what was actually happening at our location and what was being recorded by our equipment. We began to question whether our cameras and recording devices were documenting real events or somehow creating the very phenomena they appeared to be capturing. Marcus attempted to maintain professional filming procedures, but it became increasingly clear that our equipment was recording far more than we had intended to document. The footage showed not only the historical figures and activities I described, but also contemporary people who appeared to be filming crews like ourselves from different time periods. We could see other documentary teams, photographers, and researchers working at the same Skull Cliff location during what appeared to be different decades. The final incident occurred late in the afternoon when Sarah's camera began recording our own crew from what appeared to be different perspectives and time periods. We could see ourselves in the footage, but also versions of ourselves that appeared to be older or younger, wearing different clothing and using different equipment. The recorded versions of ourselves seemed to be aware of being filmed and were looking directly into Sarah's camera despite the fact that we were not posing for those shots. Robert's audio equipment recorded conversations between these different versions of ourselves discussing filming projects and documentary content that we had never worked on. The voices were definitely ours, but the conversations referenced experiences and locations that we had no memory of visiting. The audio suggested that we had been filming at Skull Cliff multiple times over a period of many years, though this was actually our first visit to the location. We made the decision to end filming immediately and pack our equipment for departure. The psychological impact of the recorded phenomena was affecting our ability to think clearly and make rational decisions about our safety and the completion of our project. Marcus was concerned that continued exposure to whatever was causing these recording anomalies might have lasting effects on our mental health and professional capabilities. But when we attempted to leave Skull Cliff, we discovered that our vehicles would not start despite the fact that they had been functioning normally when we arrived. Our satellite communication devices were not receiving signals, and our GPS navigation systems were providing inconsistent location readings. We appeared to be stranded at the filming location with no ability to call for assistance or navigate back to established roads. We spent the night at Skull Cliff using our emergency camping equipment, but none of us were able to sleep due to ongoing audio and visual phenomena that continued even after our cameras and recording equipment had been turned off. We could hear conversations and activities around our campsite that suggested the presence of other people, but visual inspection revealed that we were alone at the location. The sounds continued throughout the night and seemed to be coming from different time periods simultaneously. The next morning, our vehicles started normally and our communication and navigation equipment resumed normal function. We were able to leave Skull Cliff without further difficulty and return to Las Vegas to begin reviewing our footage and planning the editing process for our documentary. But when we attempted to access the recorded material from our final day of filming, we discovered that all of our equipment had experienced complete data corruption. The footage and audio recordings from Skull Cliff were completely unusable due to file corruption that affected every storage device and backup system we had used. Our professional equipment had never experienced such comprehensive data loss, and technical analysis could not identify any cause for the corruption. We lost an entire day of filming and had no usable content from what should have been the most important location in our documentary project. We never completed the Grand Canyon Legends documentary because we could not explain the loss of our Skull Cliff footage to the network executives who had funded our project. The incident effectively ended our working relationship with that particular network, and several members of our crew left the documentary production industry shortly afterward. Marcus now works in commercial video production, and Sarah has moved to still photography rather than cinematography. I have never returned to Skull Cliff, and I now avoid documentary projects that involve investigations of unexplained phenomena or paranormal activity. Our equipment recorded things that should not have been possible, and I suspect that some locations are not meant to be documented by contemporary technology. There are places where the act of filming creates more questions than answers, and Skull Cliff appears to be one of those locations where the boundaries between past and present become dangerously unstable. My grandfather told me stories about Skull Cliff that I never believed until the day I had to guide tourists there and witnessed why our people avoid that cursed place. My name is Thomas Bigay, and I am a member of the Navajo Nation who works as a licensed wilderness guide for tourists visiting remote areas of the Grand Canyon. For 15 years, I have led hiking expeditions, photography tours, and cultural education trips throughout the canyon region, sharing the natural beauty and traditional knowledge of our ancestral lands with visitors from around the world. Growing up on the reservation, I heard many stories from my grandfather about places in the canyon that were dangerous or spiritually significant in ways that outsiders could not understand. He would tell me about locations where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was thin, and where modern people could encounter things that were not meant for contemporary eyes. I always thought these were just traditional stories meant to teach respect for the land, but I never considered them to be literal warnings about specific dangers. Skull Cliff was one of the places my grandfather specifically warned me never to visit, especially not with groups of tourists who lacked proper spiritual preparation and protection. He told me that the limestone formations in that area contained the remains of ancient beings who had violated natural laws and been imprisoned in the rock as punishment for their crimes against the earth. According to his stories, these beings could influence the minds of people who spent too much time near their stone prison, causing them to see and hear things that would drive them to madness. But as a professional wilderness guide, I could not simply refuse clients who requested trips to specific locations based on traditional stories that I did not fully believe. When the Henderson family from Denver contacted me in March to arrange a 3-day guided tour that specifically included Skull Cliff, I accepted their booking despite my grandfather's warnings. They were experienced hikers who had done extensive research on Grand Canyon geology and were particularly interested in the limestone formations and fossil deposits that made Skull Cliff scientifically significant. The Henderson family consisted of Dr. Michael Henderson, a geology professor at the University of Colorado, his wife Jennifer, who worked as a museum curator, and their 2 teenage children, Sarah and Robert. They were knowledgeable about desert safety and wilderness survival, and they carried professional quality equipment for photography and specimen collection. They seemed like ideal clients who would appreciate both the natural beauty and the cultural significance of the areas we would be visiting. The first 2 days of our guided tour went exactly according to my planned itinerary. We visited several established viewpoints and geological sites where I could share both scientific information and traditional Navajo perspectives on the landscape and its history. The Henderson family was respectful and genuinely interested in learning about indigenous relationships with the land, and I felt comfortable sharing some of the cultural knowledge that my grandfather had taught me about reading the desert environment. On our final day, we hiked to Skull Cliff in the early morning hours when the lighting conditions would be optimal for photography, and when the desert temperatures would still be manageable for extended outdoor activity. I led the family to a safe viewing area approximately half a mile from the main cliff formations, where they could take photographs and conduct their geological observations without venturing into areas that I considered potentially dangerous based on my grandfather's warnings. But Dr. Henderson was not satisfied with observing the cliff formations from a distance. He wanted to collect mineral samples and examine the limestone layers up close, which would require hiking much closer to the base of the cliffs and potentially climbing to reach the most interesting geological features. He had permits for specimen collection and assured me that he had extensive experience with technical climbing in canyon environments. Against my better judgment and despite the persistent feeling that my grandfather's warnings should be taken seriously, I agreed to guide the family closer to the cliff face so that Dr. Henderson could conduct his geological research. We approached the limestone formations using established animal trails that provided relatively safe passage through the rocky terrain, and we reached the base of the cliffs without incident around midday when the sun was directly overhead. The first signs that something was wrong appeared when we were setting up our base camp at the bottom of the cliff. Sarah, the teenage daughter, began complaining of severe headaches and nausea that seemed to come and went without any obvious cause. She had been fine during our morning hike, but as soon as we established our position near the limestone cliffs, she became visibly ill and disoriented. Her mother attributed the symptoms to altitude and desert heat, but I recognized the signs that my grandfather had described as the beginning of spiritual interference. Dr. Henderson began his geological examination of the cliff face, using professional tools to collect samples from different limestone layers and documenting the mineral composition of the various rock formations. But as he worked, he started reporting discoveries that did not match any known geological features of the Skull Cliff area. He claimed to be finding fossil specimens that appeared to be human remains embedded in rock formations that predated human presence in North America by millions of years. More disturbing were the photographs that Jennifer was taking of her husband's geological work. When she reviewed the images on her digital camera, she discovered that the photographs showed additional people working alongside Dr. Henderson who had not been present when the pictures were taken. The photographs clearly showed her husband collecting samples, but they also showed other individuals wearing different clothing and using different tools, as if multiple groups of researchers from different time periods were occupying the same location simultaneously. Robert, the teenage son, began experiencing auditory hallucinations around the same time that his sister was dealing with her unexplained illness, and his mother was discovering the anomalous photographs. He reported hearing voices speaking in languages he could not understand, but the voices seemed to be providing him with detailed information about the geological history of the cliff area and the location of mineral deposits that his father had not yet discovered. I recognized these symptoms as exactly what my grandfather had warned me about, and I knew that we needed to leave Skull Cliff immediately before the spiritual interference became more intense or dangerous. But when I tried to convince the Henderson family that we should return to our established campsite, they were reluctant to abandon Dr. Henderson's research when he was making what appeared to be significant geological discoveries. The situation deteriorated rapidly during the afternoon hours when the sun began casting longer shadows across the cliff face. Sarah's illness became so severe that she was unable to walk without assistance, and she began speaking in what sounded like the same unknown languages that Robert was hearing in his auditory hallucinations. Jennifer's camera continued to record people and activities that were not present, and the photographs began showing the cliff area during what appeared to be different historical periods. Dr. Henderson became completely focused on his geological work to the exclusion of his family's obvious distress, collecting samples and making measurements with an intensity that seemed driven by something beyond normal scientific curiosity. He claimed that the limestone contained evidence of advanced civilizations that predated known human history, and he was convinced that his discoveries would revolutionize understanding of North American archaeology. But the most terrifying development came when I realized that I was also beginning to experience the same symptoms that were affecting the Henderson family. I started hearing voices in traditional Navajo dialect that seemed to be coming from within the cliff face itself. The voices were warning me about the danger we were in and instructing me to use traditional protection ceremonies that my grandfather had taught me but that I had never taken seriously until that moment. Following the guidance of the voices, I began performing a traditional cleansing ceremony using sacred tobacco and prayers that my grandfather had taught me for dealing with spiritual interference. I instructed the Henderson family to gather closely around me and to avoid looking directly at the cliff face while I completed the ceremony. The family was initially skeptical about participating in what they saw as superstitious rituals, but their obvious distress made them willing to try anything that might provide relief. The ceremony worked immediately and dramatically. Sarah's illness disappeared completely, Robert's auditory hallucinations stopped, and Jennifer's camera began functioning normally without recording anomalous images. Dr. Henderson seemed to wake up from his obsessive focus on the geological research and expressed concern about his family's welfare for the first time since we had arrived at the cliff site. We packed our equipment quickly and left Skull Cliff that afternoon, returning to established campgrounds where we spent our final night before returning to civilization. The Henderson family did not discuss their experiences at Skull Cliff during our remaining time together, and they seemed eager to forget what had happened during their geological research expedition. When Dr. Henderson later attempted to analyze the mineral samples he had collected from the limestone cliff, he found that they were completely ordinary limestone with no unusual properties or embedded fossils. The photographs that had shown multiple groups of researchers working at the same location showed only the Henderson family when reviewed in normal lighting conditions. All evidence of their anomalous experiences had disappeared once they were away from the direct influence of the cliff site. I never guided another tour group to Skull Cliff, and I now refuse requests from clients who specifically want to visit that location. My grandfather's warnings about places where the spirit world intersects with the physical world were not traditional stories or metaphorical teachings about respecting nature. They were literal warnings about specific locations where ancient spiritual forces remain active and can influence the minds and perceptions of people who lack proper preparation and protection. The limestone cliffs contain something more than geological formations and mineral deposits. There are places in the Grand Canyon where traditional knowledge and modern science intersect in ways that most people are not prepared to understand. And Skull Cliff is one of those places where our ancestors left warnings that should be heeded by anyone who values their mental and spiritual health. I have free climbed some of the most dangerous cliffs in North America, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the hidden cave system behind Skull Cliff's rock face. My name is Samantha Mitchell, and I have been a professional rock climber for 12 years. Specializing in technical ascents of limestone formations throughout the southwestern United States. I have conquered vertical walls in Yosemite, completed first ascents in Utah's Red Rock Country, and guided climbing expeditions in remote wilderness areas where few people have ever set foot. The Skull Cliff ascent was not originally planned as part of any official climbing expedition. I was in the Grand Canyon area conducting reconnaissance for a climbing magazine article about undocumented limestone routes when I discovered the cliff formation during a solo hiking trip in February. The limestone walls presented technical challenges that immediately caught my attention. With vertical sections that would require advanced climbing techniques and equipment that most recreational climbers would never attempt. What made Skull Cliff particularly appealing from a climbing perspective was the apparent absence of any established routes or previous climbing attempts. The cliff face showed no signs of anchor points, rappel stations, or the chalk marks that typically indicate where other climbers have attempted ascents. This suggested that I would be making a first ascent of a significant limestone formation, which represents the kind of achievement that serious climbers spend years searching for in increasingly crowded climbing areas. I returned to Skull Cliff 3 weeks later with a complete rack of climbing gear, including ropes, hardware, safety equipment, and enough supplies for a multi-day climbing expedition. My plan was to establish several different routes up the cliff face, document the climbs with photography, and potentially publish the first guidebook coverage of what appeared to be a virgin climbing area within reasonable access of major population centers. The limestone rock quality at Skull Cliff was exceptional, offering solid handholds and reliable protection placements that made the technical climbing both challenging and safe. I completed 2 successful routes up different sections of the cliff face during my first day, reaching heights of approximately 200 feet above the canyon floor and establishing anchor systems that would allow for clean rappel descents back to the base. But during my third route attempt on the main cliff face, I discovered something that was not visible from ground level or from the lower sections of the cliff. At approximately 150 feet above the canyon floor, the limestone formation contained a horizontal opening that appeared to be the entrance to a natural cave system extending deep into the cliff structure. The opening was large enough for human passage, but was positioned in a location that would be impossible to reach without advanced climbing skills. The cave entrance was not marked on any topographical maps of the area, and it showed no signs of previous human visitation despite being located in a region where Native American peoples had lived for thousands of years. The lack of any historical or archaeological documentation of the cave system suggested that it had remained hidden and inaccessible throughout recorded history, making it a potentially significant discovery from both geological and anthropological perspectives. I decided to explore the cave system as part of my climbing expedition, using my technical gear to establish a secure anchor point at the cave entrance that would allow for safe exploration and retreat if necessary. I carried extra headlamps, rope, and emergency supplies into the cave passages, following standard spelunking safety protocols despite my lack of extensive cave exploration experience. The cave passages extended much deeper into the cliff than I had anticipated based on the external appearance of the limestone formation. After crawling and climbing through narrow tunnels for approximately 200 yards, I emerged into a large underground chamber that appeared to be a natural cavern with dimensions comparable to a cathedral interior. My headlamp illuminated smooth limestone walls that rose beyond the reach of my light beam into what appeared to be a domed ceiling. But the most remarkable discovery in the underground chamber was evidence of extensive human modification and habitation that appeared to date back centuries or possibly millennia. The cave walls contained carved symbols and pictographs that resembled Native American petroglyphs, but included geometric patterns and symbolic representations that I had never seen in any archaeological documentation of southwestern indigenous art. More significantly, the chamber contained constructed stone platforms, water collection systems, and storage areas that indicated sophisticated engineering and long-term habitation by people who possessed advanced knowledge of underground construction techniques. The stonework was expertly fitted without mortar, using techniques that matched the precision of ancient Puebloan architecture, but on a scale that exceeded anything I had encountered in documented archaeological sites. The cave system extended beyond the main chamber through additional passages that led deeper into the cliff structure. Using my climbing gear to navigate vertical sections within the cave, I discovered multiple levels of chambers and tunnels that formed a complex underground network. Each level contained evidence of human habitation, including sleeping areas, food storage, tool caches, and elaborate stone carvings that suggested a sophisticated and long-established community. But despite the clear evidence of extensive human occupation, the cave system was completely empty of any contemporary inhabitants. The sleeping areas appeared recently used. Food, storage areas contained preserved supplies, and tool caches included both ancient implements and surprisingly modern equipment. It was as if an entire underground community had simply vanished, leaving behind their entire material culture and infrastructure. The most disturbing discovery came when I reached the deepest accessible level of the cave system, approximately 400 feet into the cliff structure and 100 feet below the original cave entrance. In the deepest chamber, I found evidence of recent climbing equipment, including ropes, anchors, and personal gear that clearly belonged to other climbers who had discovered and explored the cave system before my arrival. Among the abandoned climbing gear, I found personal identification and equipment tags that belonged to climbers I recognized from the professional climbing community. Michael Chen, Jennifer Adams, and Robert Torres were all accomplished climbers who had disappeared during solo climbing expeditions in Arizona over the past 2 years. Their disappearances had been attributed to climbing accidents in remote areas where rescue operations were unable to locate their bodies. But the climbing equipment in the deepest cave chamber was carefully organized and stored rather than scattered, as would be expected from climbing accidents or emergency situations. The gear appeared to have been deliberately cached by climbers who intended to return for it at a later time. Personal belongings, including journals, cameras, and survival supplies, suggested that these climbers had been using the cave system as a base camp for extended periods. The climbing journals contained detailed documentation of routes and exploration within the cave system, describing passages and chambers that extended much deeper than I had explored. The journal entries indicated that the missing climbers had discovered additional levels of the underground complex that contained increasingly elaborate stone construction and carved artwork, representing what they described as an ancient civilization of remarkable sophistication. but the final journal entries from each of the missing climbers described experiences that suggested psychological effects from extended time in the cave system. They reported hearing voices calling from deeper passages, seeing lights and movement in areas where no other people were present, and feeling compelled to explore increasingly dangerous sections of the underground complex despite their concerns about their safety and their ability to find their way back to the surface. The last entry in Michael Chen's journal, dated approximately 6 months before my discovery of the equipment cache, described his decision to attempt a descent into what he called the deepest chamber of the cave system, following voices that seemed to be calling for help from far below his position. His final written words expressed both excitement about making a significant discovery and concern that he might not be able to return to share his findings with the outside world. At that point, I made the immediate decision to retreat from the cave system and return to the surface as quickly as possible. The evidence suggested that other climbers had become lost or trapped in the deeper passages, and I had no desire to add my name to the list of missing persons associated with the Skull Cliff cave system. I left the cached equipment undisturbed and followed my established route back toward the cave entrance. But during my retreat through the cave passages, I began to experience the same phenomena that the missing climbers had described in their journals. I heard voices calling from deeper within the cave system, speaking in languages I could not identify but conveying an unmistakable sense of urgency and appeal for assistance. The voices seemed to know my name and were specifically calling for me to return to the deeper chambers. I also began experiencing equipment malfunctions that had not occurred during my initial exploration of the cave system. My primary headlamp began flickering and producing inconsistent illumination. My backup lights were draining their batteries at an abnormal rate, and my climbing rope was developing frays and weak points that had not been present when I entered the caves. Most disturbing was the growing sense that I was not alone in the cave passages despite having seen no evidence of other people during my exploration. I heard footsteps and movement behind me as I climbed toward the surface, and I frequently felt the sensation of someone pulling on my climbing rope in ways that seemed intentional rather than accidental contact with rock surfaces. I successfully exited the cave system and completed my rappel descent to the canyon floor, but the psychological effects of my underground experience continued for several weeks after I returned to civilization. I experienced recurring dreams about the missing climbers calling for rescue from the deepest chambers of the cave system, and I felt persistent guilt about leaving their equipment behind rather than attempting to continue their exploration. I never published my planned climbing article about Skull Cliff, and I have not returned to the area since my cave discovery. The climbing routes I established on the cliff face represent excellent technical challenges that would appeal to advanced climbers, but I cannot recommend the area knowing what lies hidden behind the limestone walls. There are discoveries waiting in those underground chambers that exceed the scope of recreational climbing activities, and I suspect that the missing climbers found something in the deepest passages that prevented them from returning to share their knowledge with the outside world. I took the overnight security job at the Skull Cliff Research Station because the pay was good and I needed the quiet. But some nights the silence is filled with sounds that should not exist. My name is Raymond Torres, and I have worked as a private security guard for 15 years. Mostly at construction sites, office buildings, and industrial facilities throughout New Mexico and Arizona. The assignment at Skull Cliff was different from my usual contracts because it involved protecting a remote scientific research facility, rather than preventing theft or vandalism at commercial properties. The research station was established by a consortium of universities and government agencies to study the geological and archaeological significance of the Skull Cliff area. The facility consisted of 3 modular buildings housing laboratory equipment, data storage systems, communication gear, and temporary living quarters for researchers who needed to stay on site during extended fieldwork periods. My job was to provide overnight security coverage from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 7 days a week, with 1 weekend off per month. The position was advertised as an ideal assignment for security guards who preferred working alone and could handle the isolation of a remote desert location. The pay was significantly higher than typical security work because of the location and the specialized nature of the research being conducted. The contract included housing in a comfortable trailer on the facility grounds, all utilities paid, and access to satellite internet and television for entertainment during the quiet overnight hours. During my initial orientation, the facility manager, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, explained that the research station operated with minimal staffing and that researchers were typically present only during daytime hours. My primary responsibilities were to monitor the perimeter security systems, conduct hourly facility inspections, maintain communication logs, and respond to any equipment alarms or unauthorized intrusions. She emphasized that the scientific equipment was extremely valuable and that maintaining security was essential for the ongoing research projects. The first few weeks of overnight shifts passed without incident. The desert location was indeed very quiet, with only occasional wildlife sounds and the normal settling noises from the modular buildings. I established a routine of hourly perimeter walks, equipment checks, and radio communications with the central monitoring station in Phoenix. The isolation was actually peaceful after years of dealing with urban security problems, and I found the work less stressful than my previous assignments. But as I became more familiar with the facility and the surrounding area, I began to notice unusual characteristics about the research station that had not been mentioned during my orientation. The security cameras were positioned not only to monitor approaches to the buildings, but also to observe specific areas of the cliff face that seemed to have no relevance to protecting the facility. The motion sensors and alarm systems were calibrated to detect activity in areas that were far beyond the normal perimeter of the research station. More puzzling was the discovery that some of the scientific equipment in the laboratory buildings was designed for monitoring and recording rather than analysis or research. There were sensitive audio recording systems with directional microphones aimed at the cliff face, seismic monitoring equipment that seemed designed to detect underground activity, and electromagnetic field detectors that operated continuously throughout the night. This equipment suggested that the researchers were studying active phenomena rather than static geological formations. The first unusual incident occurred during my third week on the job at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night. While conducting my regular perimeter inspection, I heard what sounded like voices calling from the direction of Skull Cliff, about a quarter-mile from the research station. The voices were too distant to make out specific words, but they seemed to be human rather than animal sounds, and they appeared to be trying to communicate or call for attention. I used my high-powered flashlight and binoculars to scan the cliff area, but I could see no signs of people or any other source for the voices. The sounds continued intermittently for about 20 minutes, then stopped completely. I documented the incident in my security log and reported it to the central monitoring station. But I was told that voices in the desert could be explained by wind effects, echoes from distant traffic, or wildlife sounds that can mimic human speech. But over the following nights, the voices became a regular occurrence, always appearing between midnight and 4 in the morning, and always seeming to originate from the cliff area. The voices were sometimes individual calls, sometimes what sounded like conversations between multiple people, and occasionally what seemed to be organized group activities like singing or chanting. The sounds were clear enough that I could determine they were definitely human voices, but I never saw any people in the area during my visual inspections. I began using the facility's scientific equipment to investigate the source of the voices, operating the directional microphones and recording systems during the overnight hours when the sounds typically occurred. The recordings confirmed that the voices were real and not products of my imagination or audio hallucinations caused by isolation and fatigue. But the recorded voices contained characteristics that were difficult to explain through normal acoustic phenomena. The voices appeared to be speaking in multiple languages simultaneously, including what sounded like English, Spanish, and several Native American dialects. But the recordings also captured conversations in languages that I could not identify, and that seemed to follow linguistic patterns unlike any modern languages I had encountered. Some of the voices sounded contemporary, while others had acoustic qualities that suggested they were coming from much greater distances or different environmental conditions. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the recorded voices were discussing the research station and my security activities. The voices knew details about the facility, the scientific equipment, and my daily routines that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the research project. The conversations referenced my name, my work schedule, and my background in ways that suggested ongoing surveillance or monitoring of the facility by unknown individuals. After 6 weeks on the job, I experienced a more direct encounter with whatever was causing the voice phenomena. During my midnight perimeter inspection, I discovered that one of the security cameras monitoring the cliff area was displaying images that did not match what I could see directly. The camera showed multiple people moving around the base of the cliffs, apparently conducting some type of organized activity involving lights, equipment, and what appeared to be construction or excavation work. But when I looked directly at the cliff area using binoculars and high-powered spotlights, I could see no people, no lights, and no signs of any activity. The camera continued to show clear images of people working in the area, while my direct visual observation revealed nothing but empty desert landscape. The discrepancy between the camera feed and direct observation continued for over an hour before the camera images returned to showing the same empty landscape that I could observe directly. I documented this incident in detail and contacted Dr. Hendricks to report the camera malfunction. But she told me that the camera systems were functioning normally and suggested that desert atmospheric conditions could cause optical illusions or recording anomalies. She instructed me to continue my normal security duties and not to be concerned about technical issues with the scientific equipment unless there were actual security breaches or unauthorized personnel on the facility grounds. But during the following weeks, multiple cameras began displaying images that did not correspond to direct visual observation. The cameras showed people, vehicles, structures, and activities in areas that appeared completely empty when observed directly. The discrepancies were consistent across different camera systems and occurred at the same times as the voice phenomena, suggesting a connection between the visual and audio anomalies. The electromagnetic field detectors also began registering significant activity during the same time periods when the cameras and audio equipment were recording anomalous phenomena. The readings indicated electromagnetic disturbances that were much stronger than normal background levels, and that seemed to originate from specific locations around the cliff area. The patterns suggested organized sources of electromagnetic activity rather than random environmental fluctuations. After 3 months on the job, I realized that the research station was not studying geological formations or archaeological sites, but was monitoring active paranormal phenomena that occurred regularly in the Skull Cliff area. The scientific equipment was designed to document and analyze supernatural activities, and my security position was intended to provide protection for researchers who were investigating dangerous or unpredictable supernatural forces. The final incident that convinced me to terminate my security contract occurred during a particularly intense night of voice and camera phenomena. While conducting my 2 o'clock perimeter inspection, I encountered a group of people walking toward the research station from the direction of Skull Cliff. The people appeared to be researchers or scientists carrying equipment and wearing clothing appropriate for desert field work, but they were not scheduled to be at the facility during overnight hours. When I approached the group to verify their authorization to be on the facility grounds, they seemed surprised to see me and claimed they were part of a research team that had been working at the site for several days. They knew details about the facility and the research projects that seemed authentic, but their names were not on any of the personnel lists I had been provided, and they had no identification or documentation that would authorize their presence during secured overnight hours. The group asked detailed questions about my security procedures, my work schedule, and the operation of the monitoring equipment. They seemed particularly interested in the electromagnetic field detectors and the audio recording systems, asking technical questions about the equipment capabilities and data storage procedures. Their knowledge of the scientific equipment was extensive and suggested professional familiarity with the research operations. But when I attempted to contact Dr. Hendricks to verify the authorization of these researchers, my radio and satellite phone systems experienced complete communication failures. The group became agitated when they realized I was trying to contact the facility management, and they began moving toward the laboratory buildings in ways that seemed intended to avoid the security cameras and motion sensors. At that point, I activated the facility alarm systems and demanded that the group identify themselves and provide proper authorization or leave the premises immediately. But instead of complying with my security instructions, the group simply walked through the perimeter fence as if it was not there and disappeared into the desert landscape without any apparent concern about the activated alarms or my attempts to detain them. I submitted my resignation the following morning and left the Skull Cliff assignment immediately. The incidents I experienced during my 3 months at the research station convinced me that some security positions involve protecting against threats that fall outside normal training and procedures, and that the Skull Cliff facility was monitoring phenomena that posed risks to personnel that were not adequately addressed in standard security protocols.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another chilling collection of forgotten accounts buried deep in the shadows of time. In this episode, we will dive deep into the heart of American small towns with 6 harrowing tales of the most disturbing true horror stories that have emerged from these seemingly quiet communities. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from first-hand testimonies of residents who lived through these terrifying experiences in places where everyone knows your name, but nobody knows your secrets. These are the confessions of ordinary people who witnessed extraordinary evil in towns with populations that could fit in a high school gymnasium. To protect the identities of those involved, some names and locations have been carefully altered, but the core truth of each account remains intact. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what really happens when the sun sets on small-town America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the darkest files that small communities tried to bury forever. I delivered mail in Millfield for 12 years, and I thought I knew every secret in that town. When you walk the same routes day after day, season after season, you become part of the landscape. People wave from their windows, leave you cold drinks in summer, and shovel paths to their mailboxes in winter. You learn which houses get medical supply deliveries, which ones have college kids coming home, and which ones never seem to get anything but bills and catalogs. But there was something happening on Elm Street that took me 12 years to notice, and another 6 months to understand. Millfield is the kind of place where 3,000 people call home, where Main Street has more empty storefronts than open businesses, and where everyone knows your business before you do. It sits in a valley between two hills, surrounded by maple forests that turn the whole town gold every October. The kind of place people drive through on their way to somewhere else, never stopping long enough to see what lurks beneath the surface. My route covered the whole town, but Elm Street was always my favorite. 12 houses lined up in a perfect row, each one built in the 1940s with identical front porches and small front yards. The residents were mostly older folks who had lived there for decades. Mrs. Patterson at number 4 always had her porch light on and would wave from her kitchen window. Mr. Rodriguez at number 8 kept the most immaculate garden I had ever seen. The Hendersons at number 12 had lived there since they were newlyweds in 1963. For 11 years, I delivered their mail without paying much attention to the details. Bills, magazines, the occasional package. Normal small-town postal delivery. But during my 12th year, something started nagging at me. It was March when I first noticed it. A subtle pattern that my subconscious had been tracking long before my rational mind caught up. Every third Thursday of the month, without fail, each house on Elm Street received an identical package. Same size, same weight, same return address that I could never quite make out through the smudged ink. The packages were wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a hardcover book, and they always arrived on the same delivery truck from the regional sorting facility. 12 packages, 12 houses, every third Thursday, like clockwork. At first, I assumed it was some kind of subscription service, maybe a book club or vitamin delivery. Small towns have their quirks, and if all the residents of one street wanted to order the same thing, that was their business. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. These people barely talked to each other. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen from number 6 had been in a property line dispute for 15 years. The Rodriguezes kept to themselves, and the young couple at number 10 had only moved in 2 years ago. The return address was always the same, but I could never read it clearly. The ink looked deliberately smudged, as if someone had run their thumb across it while it was still wet. I tried holding the packages up to the light in my truck, but the brown paper was too thick to see through. The weight was consistent, maybe 2 pounds, and they never rattled when I shook them gently. By May, my curiosity was getting the better of me. I started paying closer attention to the residents on Elm Street, especially on package delivery days. Mrs. Patterson would usually meet me at the mailbox with a smile and a comment about the weather. But on third Thursdays, she would stay inside until I left, then quickly retrieve her package. Through her front window, I could see her carrying it straight to her basement door. The same thing happened at every house. No one came out to greet me on package days. No one left their packages sitting on the porch like they usually did with other deliveries. Within minutes of my departure, I would see curtains twitch and front doors open just long enough for the packages to disappear inside. I started keeping a mental log. March 18th, April 15th, May 20th, June 17th. Always the third Thursday, always 12 identical packages. I began timing my route differently on those days, parking at the end of Elm Street where I could observe the houses after making my deliveries. Every single resident followed the same pattern. Quick retrieval, straight into the house, curtains drawn tight for the rest of the day. The breakthrough came in July when I was delivering a certified letter to Mrs. Patterson. She was expecting her Social Security documents and had asked me to bring them to her door instead of leaving them in the mailbox. When she answered, I could smell something strange coming from inside her house. It was not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Sweet and herbal, like burning sage mixed with something medicinal. "Busy day today, Mrs. Patterson?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked nervous for the first time in 12 years. "Oh, you know how it is, Thomas. Just some spring cleaning." But it was July, and the smell was definitely not cleaning supplies. That evening, I drove back to Elm Street after my shift ended. Every house was dark except for a strange, flickering glow coming from the basement windows. Not electric light, but something softer, like candles or oil lamps. And if I strained my ears, I could hear a low humming sound, like multiple voices chanting in unison. I parked across the street and watched for over an hour. The flickering lights moved in synchronized patterns, and the humming would rise and fall in waves. At exactly 11 o'clock, everything stopped. The lights went out, the humming ceased, and normal house lights began turning on throughout the street. August came, and with it, another delivery of 12 identical packages. This time, I was ready. I had borrowed a small digital camera from my nephew and planned to document whatever was happening. But when I arrived at Elm Street that Thursday morning, something was different. Mrs. Patterson was waiting at her mailbox, but she was not alone. Mr. Rodriguez stood at his mailbox at number 8. The Hendersons were at number 12. In fact, all 12 residents of Elm Street were standing at their mailboxes, watching me approach. They did not speak as I delivered their packages. They just stood there, 12 pairs of eyes following my every movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the pavement and the rustle of paper as I placed each package in its designated mailbox. When I finished and returned to my truck, they were still standing there, still watching. I started the engine and began to drive away. But in my rearview mirror, I could see them forming a circle in the middle of the street. They were opening their packages in unison, removing identical items that I could not make out from that distance. That night, I could not sleep. Something was seriously wrong on Elm Street, and I had been unknowingly facilitating it for months. I decided to research the return address on the packages, even though it was barely legible. It took me 3 days of squinting at delivery labels before I could make out enough letters to attempt a search. The address traced back to a post office box in Salem, Massachusetts, registered to something called the Millfield Heritage Society. I had never heard of any heritage society in our town, and when I asked around, no one else had either. The postmaster in Salem was helpful, but could only tell me that the box had been rented for over 30 years, always paid in cash, always by different people. I started digging into Millfield's history, spending my evenings at the town library and searching through old records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Elm Street had been built on land that was once the site of the original Millfield settlement, founded in 1692 by refugees from the Salem witch trials. According to the records, 12 families had fled Salem and established a small community in the Vermont wilderness. They had built their homes in a circle and practiced what they called the old ways, away from the prying eyes of Puritan authorities. The settlement had prospered for decades, but in 1734, something had gone wrong. The official records were vague, mentioning only that the settlement had been abandoned due to crop failures and harsh winters. But I found a diary entry from a traveling minister who had visited the area in 1735. He wrote about finding the abandoned houses still standing, but with strange symbols carved into the wooden beams and scorch marks on the floors where fires had burned in perfect circles. The minister had also noted that the graves in the settlement cemetery contained no bodies, 12 headstones, 12 empty graves, and no explanation for what had happened to the families who had once lived there. By September, I was becoming obsessed with the mystery of Elm Street. I had convinced myself that the current residents were part of some kind of historical reenactment group or genealogical society. Maybe they were descendants of the original settlers, honoring their ancestors with monthly gatherings. It was strange, but not necessarily sinister. But then came the third Thursday in September, and everything changed. I arrived at Elm Street to find it deserted. No residents waiting at their mailboxes, no curtains twitching in windows, no signs of life at all. The packages were in my truck as usual. But when I stepped out to begin deliveries, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every single house on Elm Street was identical now. Not just similar in architecture, but perfectly identical. The paint was the same shade of white on every house, the shutters the same shade of green, the front porches exactly the same height and width. Even the landscaping was identical, with the same flowers planted in the same patterns in every yard. I had been walking this street for 12 years, and I knew every house by heart. Mrs. Patterson's house had always had blue shutters. The Rodriguezes had replaced their front steps with brick ones just 2 years ago. The Hendersons had a distinctive oak tree in their front yard that was older than the house itself. Now, all of those individual details were gone. 12 identical houses, as if they had all been built yesterday using the same blueprint. I stood in the middle of the street, packages clutched in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That was when I noticed the mailboxes. Each one had a name printed on it in identical block letters. But they were not the names of the people I had been delivering mail to for 12 years. Patterson, Rodriguez, Henderson, and all the others were gone. Instead, the mailboxes bore the names I had found in the historical records: Whitmore, Blackwood, Ashworth, and 9 others that matched the original Salem refugee families. I should have left then. I should have driven straight to the police station and reported what I had seen. Instead, I found myself walking up to the first house, the one that had belonged to Mrs. Patterson. The package felt heavier in my hands than it should have, and I could swear I felt something moving inside it. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, and for a moment, I thought it was Mrs. Patterson. But this woman was younger, maybe in her 30s, with the same facial features but darker hair and clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. She was wearing a long black dress with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back in a style I had seen in old portraits. "You have been faithful in your service, Thomas Richardson," she said in a voice that sounded like Mrs. Patterson, but spoke with an accent I could not place. "The time has come for you to join us." Behind her, through the doorway, I could see the interior of the house. It was not Mrs. Patterson's living room with its floral wallpaper and modern furniture. Instead, I glimpsed a room lit by oil lamps, with rough wooden furniture and herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. I stumbled backward, dropping the packages on the porch. They hit the wooden boards with a sound like breaking glass, and a thick, dark liquid began seeping out of the torn brown paper. The smell that rose from the spilled contents was overwhelming. Metallic and organic, like blood mixed with rich soil. "Do not be afraid," the woman who looked like Mrs. Patterson continued. "We have been waiting for you to understand, waiting for you to see. You have been chosen to carry our messages, to help us maintain the connection between worlds. The packages you have delivered contain the essence of the old settlement, the blood and bone of our ancestors, mixed with the herbs of our craft. I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear doors opening along the entire street, and voices calling my name in unison. Not the voices of the people I had known for 12 years, but older voices, speaking in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. I made it to my truck and drove away as fast as I could. But in my rearview mirror, I could see 12 figures standing in the middle of Elm Street. They were not the residents I had known, but people in old-fashioned clothing, holding hands in a circle around the spilled contents of the packages I had dropped. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and called the police. But when they arrived at Elm Street 20 minutes later, they found nothing unusual. 12 normal houses with 12 normal residents who claimed they had no idea what I was talking about. The officers said I seemed stressed and suggested I take some time off from work. The next day, I requested a transfer to a different route. I could not bring myself to go back to Elm Street, not after what I had seen. My supervisor was understanding and assigned me to the industrial district on the other side of town. But that was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, I received a package at my own home. Same brown paper wrapping, same smudged return address, same weight and size as the ones I had been delivering to Elm Street. My name was written on it, in the same block letters I had seen on the mailboxes that day. I never opened it. I took it straight to the police station and demanded they investigate. But they treated me like a man having a nervous breakdown. The package sat on the evidence shelf for a month before they returned it to me, claiming there was nothing suspicious about a resident receiving mail. When I got home, I built a fire in my backyard and burned the package without opening it. The flames turned green when they touched the brown paper, and the smoke smelled like the herbs I had detected in Mrs. Patterson's house. As it burned, I could swear I heard voices whispering in the crackling flames, calling my name and promising that I would return to Elm Street eventually. That was 6 months ago. I moved to a different town, got a job at a hardware store, and tried to forget about Millfield and Elm Street. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of packages being delivered to my door. When I look outside, there is nothing there, but I can smell that herbal scent drifting through my window. And sometimes, when I am driving through small towns on my way to work, I see familiar faces in the windows of houses I pass. Faces that look like Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and the Hendersons, but wearing clothes from centuries past, watching me with eyes that seem to know exactly where I am and what I am trying to forget. I know they are still waiting for me on Elm Street, waiting for me to understand that some routes, once walked, can never truly be abandoned. The mail must always be delivered, and some messages are too important to remain unread. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened during the lockdown drill at Cedar Falls Elementary, least of all the other school board members. But as the newest member of the board, I thought it was my responsibility to ask the hard questions. Martha Hendricks, that is my name, and I had been elected just 6 months earlier on a platform of transparency and child safety. The parents in Cedar Falls trusted me to be their voice, to make sure their children were protected and educated properly. I wish I had never opened that door. Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up destroys everything you thought you knew about the place you call home. Cedar Falls is one of those Montana towns that exists because it has to, not because anyone particularly wants it to. 800 people scattered across a valley that gets snowed in for 4 months of the year, surrounded by mountains that look beautiful on postcards, but feel like prison walls when you live between them. The elementary school serves the whole county, bringing in kids from ranches and tiny settlements spread across 50 square miles. It is the heart of our community, the one place where everyone comes together. I had lived in Cedar Falls my whole life, raised 3 children who graduated from that same elementary school, and spent 15 years volunteering for everything from bake sales to field trips. When longtime board member Jim Patterson announced his retirement, everyone assumed I would run for his seat. I won by a landslide, mainly because nobody else wanted the job. School board meetings in small towns are usually exercises in bureaucratic tedium, arguing about budget allocations and maintenance schedules. But my first meeting in September changed everything I thought I knew about our little school and the people who ran it. The other 4 board members had all served for years. Principal Janet Morrison had been there since before my oldest child started kindergarten. Superintendent Dr. William Chen oversaw 3 small schools across the county and treated Cedar Falls Elementary like his personal kingdom. Board Chairman Robert Fitzgerald owned the largest ranch in the area and carried himself like he owned the town, too. The only other woman on the board, Susan Walsh, taught high school in the next town over and rarely spoke during meetings. Before we begin tonight's regular business, Dr. Chen announced at that September meeting, we need to review some security footage from last month's lockdown drill. He gestured to a television that had been wheeled into the conference room. Just routine documentation for our safety protocols. I had heard about the lockdown drill, of course. It had happened on a Tuesday in late August, just before school started for the year. The teachers had been preparing their classrooms when the alarm system activated, and they had followed standard procedures for securing the building. Nothing unusual about it, or so I had been told. Dr. Chen pressed play on the remote, and grainy black and white footage filled the screen. The timestamp showed August 28th, 2:15 in the afternoon. I could see teachers moving quickly through the hallways, checking that doors were locked and windows were covered. Everything looked exactly like what you would expect from a well-executed safety drill. The teachers responded perfectly, Principal Morrison noted, making a mark on her clipboard. Average response time was under 90 seconds across all classrooms. I was taking notes, trying to be diligent in my new role, when I noticed something that made me pause. "Wait," I said, pointing at the screen. "Can you rewind that last part?" Dr. Chen looked annoyed, but complied. The footage rewound to show the main hallway outside the kindergarten classrooms. Teachers were moving efficiently from room to room, but in the corner of the frame, I could see something that did not make sense. "There," I said, leaning forward. "Those 3 children in the hallway. Why are they not in a classroom during a lockdown?" The other board members exchanged glances. Chairman Fitzgerald cleared his throat. "Martha, these are just the details we work through in post-drill analysis. Nothing to be concerned about." But I was concerned. The 3 children on the footage appeared to be elementary age, walking calmly down the hallway while teachers were rushing to implement lockdown procedures. They were not running or hiding or showing any of the urgency that the situation should have demanded. They were just walking, almost casually, toward what looked like the rear exit of the building. "Who are those children?" I asked. "And why are they leaving the building during a lockdown?" Susan Walsh spoke up for the first time that evening. "Martha, these drills can be confusing. Sometimes protocols are not followed perfectly, and we make adjustments for next time. I made a note to ask for a list of all students who had been in the building that day. Something about the footage bothered me, though I could not put my finger on exactly what. The 3 children looked familiar, but I could not place them. Cedar Falls is small enough that I know most of the families, at least by sight. I would like copies of this footage for my records, I announced. As board members, we should all have access to materials that document safety procedures. Dr. Chen's response was immediate and firm. These recordings contain sensitive security information. They remain in district custody only. That response raised more red flags. In my previous volunteer work with the school, I had never encountered resistance to reasonable requests for documentation. But Chairman Fitzgerald was already moving on to budget items, and my attempts to return to the topic were smoothly deflected. Over the next few weeks, I could not shake my unease about those 3 children. I started paying closer attention to enrollment records and attendance sheets, trying to identify who had been in the building that day. The official documentation showed that 12 teachers and 2 maintenance staff had been present for the drill, but there was no mention of any children. When I asked Principal Morrison directly about student presence during the drill, she seemed confused. Students. Martha, the drill was conducted during our professional development week. No children were in the building, but I had seen them clearly on the footage. 3 elementary-aged children walking calmly through the hallway while teachers implemented lockdown procedures. Either Principal Morrison was mistaken about the date, or something else was happening that no one wanted to discuss. I decided to do my own investigation. Cedar Falls is small enough that unusual events create ripples throughout the community. And if 3 children had been in the school during what was supposed to be a staff-only day, someone would remember. I started asking casual questions during my weekly trips to the grocery store, the post office, and the diner on Main Street. The responses I received were strange and inconsistent. When I asked Linda Rodriguez at the post office if she remembered anything unusual happening at the school in late August, she got a distant look in her eyes and said, "Now that you mention it, I did see some kids walking down Maple Street that Tuesday afternoon. Thought it was odd since school had not started yet." "Do you remember what they looked like?" I pressed. Linda paused for a long moment, like she was trying to recall a dream. 3 of them, I think, walking together. But I cannot quite remember their faces. Similar conversations throughout town yielded the same pattern. People remembered seeing children that day, but no one could provide specific details about who they were or where they had gone. It was as if the entire town had a collective blind spot about 3 specific kids. My breakthrough came when I was reviewing the school's enrollment records from the past several years. I was looking for patterns, trying to identify which families might have children who would have been in the building that day for any reason. That was when I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. 3 children had been enrolled at Cedar Falls Elementary for the previous school year, but had not returned in the fall. Emma Sullivan, age 7, Michael Patterson, age 9, and Zoe Chen, age 6. According to the records, all 3 had moved away during the summer with their families. But when I cross-referenced their information with county records, I found no documentation of any family moves, no forwarding addresses, and no transfer requests to schools in other districts. Emma Sullivan's family had lived in the same house for 12 years. Michael Patterson's father worked at the grain elevator and had no reason to relocate. Zoe Chen was Dr. Chen's own niece, living with her grandparents after her parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier. I called the numbers on file for all 3 families. Emma Sullivan's phone had been disconnected. Michael Patterson's father claimed he had never heard of me and hung up when I mentioned the school board. But it was the call to Zoe Chen's grandparents that confirmed my worst fears. "Zoe?" Mrs. Chen's voice was shaky and confused. "We have not seen Zoe since..." When was it? I cannot seem to remember. She was here, and then she was not. The doctors said it was grief making us forget, but we know she existed. We have her things, her pictures. I drove to the Chen house that same afternoon. The elderly couple invited me in, and what I saw broke my heart. Zoe's bedroom was perfectly preserved, as if she had just stepped out for a few minutes. But when I looked closely at the family photographs displayed throughout the house, I noticed something disturbing. In every photo that should have included Zoe, there was a strange blur or shadow, as if someone had been carefully erased from the images. "She was right there," Mr. Chen kept saying, pointing to empty spaces in photographs. "We remember her being right there." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Chairman Fitzgerald. I presented him with everything I had discovered: the missing children, the inconsistent records, the gaps in everyone's memory. His response was not what I expected. "Martha," he said in a tone that was patient but firm, "you are dealing with a very sensitive situation that requires careful handling. Some matters are best left to those with experience in these areas." "What kind of sensitive situation involves 3 missing children and altered records?" I demanded. Fitzgerald was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was making a decision. Finally, he spoke. "Meet me at the school tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Come alone, and I will show you what really happened during that lockdown drill." I should have brought someone with me. I should have called the state police or the FBI or anyone with authority beyond our little county. Instead, I drove to Cedar Falls Elementary alone on a cold October night, my hands shaking as I unlocked the front door with the key I had been given as a board member. Chairman Fitzgerald was waiting in the main hallway with Principal Morrison and Dr. Chen. The building felt different at night, shadows stretching longer than they should and familiar spaces taking on ominous shapes. "Before we show you the complete footage," Dr. Chen said, "you need to understand the history of this building. Cedar Falls Elementary was built in 1952 on land that had previously been used for other purposes. The county purchased the property from a private organization that had operated here for many years." He led me to the library, where a projector had been set up. The screen displayed a series of photographs that looked like they had been taken decades earlier. Black and white images of the same building, but with different signage and different people. From 1928 to 1951, this was the Cedar Falls Institute for Exceptional Children, Dr. Chen continued. It was a residential facility for children with what were then called developmental disabilities, but it also served as a research center for experimental treatments. The photographs showed children in institutional clothing, standing in rows in front of the building that was now our elementary school. Their faces were blank and distant, and many appeared to be heavily medicated. The institute was closed after a state investigation revealed irregularities in their treatment methods. Principal Morrison added, 23 children who had been residents simply vanished during the final week of operation. No records of where they went, no family claims, no documentation of transfers to other facilities. I felt sick as the implications began to sink in. "You are telling me that children disappeared from this building 70 years ago, and now 3 more children have vanished?" Chairman Fitzgerald activated the projector remote, and new footage filled the screen. This was not the edited version I had seen at the board meeting. This was raw security camera footage from multiple angles, showing the entire sequence of events during the August lockdown drill. The footage began normally, with teachers implementing lockdown procedures throughout the building. But at the 2-minute mark, something extraordinary happened. 3 children simply materialized in the main hallway, not walking in from another room, not emerging from hiding places. They appeared out of thin air, like smoke condensing into solid form. Emma Sullivan, Michael Patterson, and Zoe Chen stood in the hallway for several seconds, looking around with expressions of confusion and fear. Then they began walking toward the rear exit, their movements mechanical and synchronized, like they were being controlled by an external force. "The building remembers," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Every few years, usually during times of stress or change, the Institute reasserts itself. The children who vanished in 1951 are still here, still trapped in the building's memory. And sometimes, they take living children back with them." The footage continued, showing the 3 children reaching the rear exit. But instead of opening the door and leaving, they simply walked through it, passing through solid wood and metal like they were made of mist. On the exterior camera, there was no sign of them. They had not exited the building. They had been absorbed by it. "Where are they now?" I whispered, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. "They exist in the spaces between spaces," Principal Morrison replied. "In the walls, in the foundation, in the memory of what this place used to be. We have learned to recognize the signs when the building is becoming active. The lockdown drill was not a drill at all. It was a containment protocol." Chairman Fitzgerald turned off the projector and faced me directly. "This is why board positions rarely change hands in Cedar Falls. This is why certain decisions are made by people who understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. The school serves the community, but it also serves as a prison for something that cannot be allowed to spread. You have been covering up child disappearances for decades," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have been protecting hundreds of other children," Dr. Chen corrected. "Every child who attends this school, every family in this county. The alternative is to close the building, to let whatever exists here escape into the broader world." They showed me more footage from previous years. 1998, when 2 children vanished during a fire drill. 2003, when 1 child disappeared during a severe thunderstorm. 2009, when the building claimed 3 more during a routine maintenance day. Always children who were already vulnerable, already isolated, already partially forgotten by their families and communities. "The building chooses carefully," Principal Morrison explained. "Children whose absence will create the least disruption, whose memories can be quietly erased from official records and community consciousness." "But their families remember," I protested, thinking of Mrs. Chen's confused grief. "Families remember something," Chairman Fitzgerald agreed. "But memories fade when they are not reinforced by external evidence. Pictures blur, records disappear, and eventually people convince themselves they were mistaken about what they lost." I left the school that night knowing that I faced an impossible choice. I could expose what I had learned and watch our community torn apart by investigations and media attention, while potentially releasing something far worse into the world. Or I could become complicit in a cover-up that had already claimed dozens of children over several decades. The decision was made for me 3 days later when I found a manila envelope on my front porch. Inside were professional photographs of my own grandchildren, taken recently at locations throughout Cedar Falls. Attached was a simple note: "Some secrets protect more than they harm. Welcome to the board." I have been keeping those secrets for 8 months now, I attend meetings where we discuss budget allocations and maintenance schedules, while carefully monitoring security footage for signs of the building's awakening. I help identify children who fit the profile of potential targets, and I participate in the quiet alterations of records and memories that follow each disappearance. Last month, we lost 2 more children during what the community believes was a routine safety inspection. Their families are already beginning to forget, their photographs already beginning to blur, their enrollment records already being quietly modified. And I sit in those board meetings, taking notes and asking the right questions, while 3 more empty desks wait in classrooms that will never acknowledge the children who once sat in them. Because in Cedar Falls, some kinds of education require sacrifices that can never be discussed in official minutes or annual reports. The building is stirring again. I can feel it in the way the hallways echo differently, in the way shadows move independently of their sources. Soon there will be another drill, another containment protocol, another careful selection of children whose absence will disturb the community the least. And I will be there, taking minutes and maintaining records. Because someone has to document the price we pay to keep the rest of our children safe from what lurks in the spaces between memory and forgetting. Every small town has that one place that stays open all night. And in Willow Creek, that was Mel's Diner. I worked the graveyard shift there for 8 months, and I thought I had seen everything the darkness could bring through those glass doors. Drunks stumbling home from the bar across the street, truckers needing coffee and conversation, insomniacs seeking refuge from their own thoughts. But there was one customer who changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin line that separates the two. Her name was Hazel Morrison, and she had been dead for 38 years. George Patterson is my name, and I took that job at Mel's because I needed something to pay the bills while I figured out what to do with my life. 29 years old, fresh out of a relationship that had lasted too long, and tired of pretending I had my future mapped out like everyone else my age seemed to. The overnight shift at a diner in a town of 1,500 people was not glamorous, but it was honest work that left me alone with my thoughts and a steady stream of coffee. Willow Creek sits in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, surrounded by wheat fields that stretch to every horizon. The kind of place where 3 generations of the same family live within walking distance of each other, where everyone knows your business before you do, and where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football games on Friday nights. Mel's Diner had been serving the community since 1962, occupying a converted train car on the edge of downtown, with red vinyl booths and a counter that had absorbed decades of conversations and confessions. The overnight shift was typically quiet. Between midnight and 6 in the morning, I might serve a dozen customers on a busy night, mostly regulars who worked unconventional schedules or dealt with sleep troubles. I learned their names, their orders, and their stories. Coffee black for Jim Harrison, who drove the mail truck. Pie and ice cream for Mrs. Rodriguez, who cleaned offices downtown and always stopped by around 4. Eggs over easy for Danny Walsh, who worked maintenance at the grain elevator and got off work at 3. But Hazel Morrison was different from the first night I saw her. She came in at exactly 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I noticed the precise timing because the old clock above the register had been running 7 minutes fast for months. And she entered just as it showed 3:24. She was elderly, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a blue dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. "Coffee, please," she said, settling into the corner booth by the window. Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that suggested she had grown up in this part of Kansas, but had lived elsewhere for a while. I brought her coffee in one of the heavy white mugs we used for regular customers. "Anything else?" "Pie is fresh today. Apple pie if you have it," she replied. "And vanilla ice cream?" I served her the pie and went back to my prep work for the morning shift. When I glanced over a few minutes later, she was sitting with her hands folded, looking out the window at the empty main street. The coffee cup was still full, and the pie remained untouched. She sat there for exactly 43 minutes, never drinking the coffee or eating the pie. At 4 o'clock sharp, she stood up, left exact change on the table, including a 20% tip, and walked out into the night. I watched through the window as she crossed the street and disappeared into the shadows between buildings. The next week, Tuesday night at 3:17, she returned. Same blue dress, same order, same behavior. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream, paid for but never consumed. She would sit in the corner booth for 43 minutes, staring out the window with an expression I could not read, then leave exactly at 4. After her 4th visit, I started paying closer attention. Hazel Morrison looked exactly the same each time. Not just similar clothing, but identical. The same dress with the same small wrinkle near the left shoulder. The same hairstyle with the same few strands that had escaped the bun. Even the same faint lipstick that had been applied with the same slight imperfection on the lower lip. "Do you know Hazel Morrison?" I asked Mel during one of our shift changes. He had owned the diner for 30 years and knew everyone in town. Mel paused while wiping down the counter. "Hazel Morrison died in 1987, George. Car accident out on Highway 36. Why do you ask?" "Someone with that name has been coming in during my shift. Elderly woman, blue dress, orders coffee and pie but never eats." Mel's expression grew serious. "What does she look like?" I described her in detail, including the specific way her hair was styled and the shade of blue in her dress. As I talked, Mel's face grew pale. "That is exactly what she looked like," he whispered. "But George, Hazel Morrison has been dead for 38 years. He disappeared into the back office and returned with a cardboard box filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. Most were pictures from community events and local celebrations that had been held at the diner over the decades. Near the bottom of the box, he found what he was looking for. The newspaper clipping was from October 1987. The headline read, "Local woman dies in late night accident." Below it was a photograph of Hazel Morrison, age 73, wearing the same blue dress I had seen her in every Tuesday night. The article explained that she had been driving home from a church meeting when her car skidded on wet leaves and struck a tree. She had died instantly at 3:17 in the morning. "She used to come in here every Tuesday night," Mel explained, his voice shaky. "Same time, same order. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. But she was trying to lose weight, so she would order it, then just sit with it, using the smell and the company to satisfy her craving without actually eating." According to the article, Hazel had been on her way home from the diner when the accident occurred. She had left at exactly 4 o'clock, just like she had been doing during my shifts. The accident happened less than a mile from Mel's, at the intersection of Main Street and Highway 36. "Why is she still coming here?" I asked. Mel shook his head. "I do not know. But if it is really her, there must be a reason she cannot move on." The next Tuesday, I was ready. When Hazel Morrison entered at 3:17, I watched her every movement more carefully than before. She walked with purpose, but also with a strange lightness, as if her feet barely touched the floor. When she sat down, the vinyl booth did not creak the way it did for other customers. When I brought her coffee, the mug felt strangely cold despite having just come from the pot that was kept at 180 degrees. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, sitting across from her in the booth, "can I ask you something?" She looked at me with eyes that were kind but distant, like she was seeing me from a great distance. "Of course, dear. Why do you keep coming back here?" For the first time in all her visits, her expression changed. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by what looked like fear. "I am not sure," she admitted. "I remember being here, enjoying the coffee and the pie. But I also remember being very tired, wanting to go home. I got in my car and then..." She paused, touching her forehead like she was trying to recall a difficult memory. "I cannot remember what happened next." "Mrs. Morrison," I said gently, "you died 38 years ago. You were in a car accident after leaving this diner." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. "The tree," she whispered. "I remember the tree, and the rain, and the pain." Her hand moved to her chest. "But if I died, why am I still here?" That question haunted me for the rest of the night. After she left at 4 o'clock, I drove out to the intersection where her accident had occurred. The tree was still there, a massive oak that had been scarred by the impact, but had survived. Plastic flowers and a small cross marked the spot where Hazel Morrison had died. I started researching her life, trying to understand what might be keeping her spirit anchored to that Tuesday night routine. Through old phone books and county records, I learned that she had lived alone in a small house on Elm Street. Never married, no children, but deeply involved in her church and various community organizations. By all accounts, she had been a kind and generous person who was beloved by everyone who knew her. But there was something else I discovered that changed everything. In the weeks before her death, Hazel Morrison had been investigating irregularities in the church's finances. As the treasurer, she had noticed money disappearing from various accounts and had been quietly gathering evidence of embezzlement by other church officials. The night she died, she had not been coming from a regular church meeting. She had been meeting secretly with a lawyer from the county seat, providing him with documents that would have exposed a scheme that had stolen thousands of dollars from church members and local charities. Those documents were never found after her accident. The embezzlement continued for several more years until the scheme collapsed on its own. But by then, the evidence was gone, and no one was ever prosecuted. I realized that Hazel Morrison was trapped in the last night of her life because she had died with unfinished business. She had been carrying the weight of truth that needed to be revealed, and her death had prevented justice from being served. The next Tuesday, when she arrived at 3:17, I was waiting with a folder full of everything I had learned about her investigation and the embezzlement scheme. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, placing the folder on the table, "I think I know why you are still here." I explained what I had discovered about her final mission and how her death had allowed criminals to escape justice. As I talked, her expression grew clearer and more focused, as if she was remembering not just who she was, but why her work had been so important. "They stole from the church," she said, her voice growing stronger. "From the food bank, from the scholarship fund, from families who trusted us with their donations. The statute of limitations has passed," I told her. "But there are still people in town who were harmed by what happened. If you can remember where you hid the evidence Maybe we can find a way to make things right. Hazel smiled for the first time since I had been serving her. The safe deposit box, she whispered. Bank of Willow Creek, box number 207. She reached into her purse, a movement that looked more real and solid than any other gesture I had seen her make. She pulled out a small brass key and placed it on the table. Give this to Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church, she said. He was not involved in the scheme. He can make sure the truth comes out, even now. As soon as she released the key, I could see her beginning to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming lighter, more transparent, like morning fog touched by sunlight. Thank you, she whispered. And for the first time since I had been serving her, she picked up the coffee cup and took a sip. That is perfect coffee, dear. Just the way I remember. She faded away completely at 4 o'clock, leaving behind only the key, exact change for her order, and the lingering scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream. I delivered the key to Pastor Williams the next morning, along with everything I'd learned about Hazel Morrison's investigation. The safe deposit box contained decades of financial documents that exposed not just the original embezzlement, but ongoing fraud that had continued long after her death. While criminal charges were no longer possible, the revelations led to civil lawsuits that recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars for victims and their families. Scholarships were established in Hazel Morrison's name, and a memorial garden was planted at the church she had died trying to protect. I never saw her again after that Tuesday night. But sometimes, when I am working the overnight shift and the clock shows 3:17, I catch the faint scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream drifting through the diner. And I know that somewhere, Hazel Morrison is finally at peace in Liette. They called me to settle a property dispute between two families who had been neighbors for 40 years, and I thought it would be a straightforward surveying job. Richard Blackwood is my name, and I've been measuring and mapping land boundaries across North Carolina for 15 years. Most property disputes involve a few feet here and there, maybe a fence that was built in the wrong place or a driveway that crosses into someone else's deed. But what I discovered in the hills outside Harmony Ridge changed everything I thought I knew about the secrets that can be buried beneath seemingly ordinary land. Harmony Ridge is one of those mountain communities that feels removed from the modern world, where families trace their roots back 6 or 7 generations, and newcomers are still considered outsiders after 20 years. The town proper has maybe 200 people, but the surrounding hills are dotted with isolated homesteads and family compounds that have been passed down through generations. It is the kind of place where people handle their own problems and view outside interference with deep suspicion. The Morrison and Fleming families had been feuding over a strip of land that separated their properties for as long as anyone could remember. According to the county clerk who hired me, the dispute had been going on since the early 1980s, with both families claiming ownership of a wedge-shaped piece of forest that covered about 3 acres. Previous surveys had been inconclusive, and the families had been taking turns filing lawsuits that went nowhere. We need a definitive boundary established, the clerk explained when she called me. The families are threatening violence over this thing, and we cannot have that in our county. I drove up to Harmony Ridge on a crisp October morning, my equipment loaded in the back of my truck and a folder full of deeds and historical maps on the passenger seat. The disputed land sat between 2 similar properties, both featuring older farmhouses with extensive outbuildings and cleared fields that had been carved from the surrounding forest decades ago. Dale Morrison met me at his front gate, a weathered man in his 60s with the kind of deep suspicion of outsiders that I had encountered in other mountain communities. "You the surveyor?" he asked without preamble. "Richard Blackwood." I introduced myself, extending my hand. "I understand you and your neighbors need some boundaries clarified." Morrison shook my hand grudgingly. "Been our land for 40 years, he said. "My daddy cleared that timber himself, and them Flemings got no right to it." The Fleming property was accessible by a dirt road that wound through thick forest before opening into their main compound. Jacob Fleming was younger than Morrison, maybe in his 50s, but he had the same hardened look of someone who had spent his life working the land. "Appreciate you coming out," Fleming said when I introduced myself. "That strip of land has been in our family since my grandfather's time. Morrisons are trying to steal what belongs to us." Both men insisted on being present when I conducted my survey, which made for a tense atmosphere as I set up my equipment. The disputed land was heavily forested, with thick undergrowth that made it difficult to move around with my instruments. But as I worked, I began to notice things that seemed unusual for a natural forest. The trees were all roughly the same age, suggesting the entire area had been cleared and replanted at some point. But more oddly, they seemed to be arranged in subtle patterns, with large gaps that formed rough geometric shapes when viewed from above. My electronic distance measuring device also detected irregularities in the ground that suggested extensive digging had been done at some point. "Has this land been used for farming?" I asked Morrison as I adjusted my theodolite. "Not since I've been here," he replied. "Been woods long as I can remember." Fleming gave a similar response, but both men seemed nervous whenever I asked about the history of the land. They kept glancing at each other across the disputed boundary, and I got the impression they were communicating something that I was not meant to understand. On my second day of surveying, my ground-penetrating radar began picking up anomalies throughout the disputed area. The equipment was designed to detect underground utilities and foundation remains, but what I was seeing looked more extensive and more irregular than anything related to construction or agriculture. "There are significant underground disturbances throughout this area," I told both families when they met me at the site that afternoon. "Before I can establish definitive boundaries, I need to understand what I am dealing with down there." Morrison and Fleming exchanged a look that I could not interpret. "What kind of disturbances?" Fleming asked. "Large excavations that have been backfilled," I explained. "Multiple sites, some quite deep. If there are septic systems or old foundations down there, they could affect property values and development rights." That evening at my motel in town, I spent hours studying the radar images on my laptop. What I was seeing was unlike anything in my 15 years of surveying. The underground disturbances were extensive and appeared to follow patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random digging. More disturbing were the shapes themselves. Long, narrow excavations arranged in rough grids, each approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. As a professional surveyor, I had seen enough cemetery layouts to recognize what I was looking at. I was looking at graves, dozens of them, scattered throughout the 3-acre disputed area. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and requested that a deputy meet me at the site. If there were unmarked graves on the property, it became a legal matter that went far beyond a simple boundary dispute. Deputy Williams arrived within an hour, and I showed him the radar images. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. "Those look like burial sites," he agreed. "But there is no cemetery recorded in this area. Are you sure your equipment is working correctly?" I ran the scans again, and the results were consistent. 43 separate anomalies, all the right size and shape to be individual graves, scattered throughout the disputed land in a pattern that suggested they had been dug over an extended period of time. "We need to notify the families," Deputy Williams said, "and probably the State Archaeological Office. If these are Native American graves or historical burials, there are procedures we have to follow." But when we approached Morrison and Fleming with our findings, their reactions were not what I expected. Instead of surprise or concern, both men went pale and began speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "You cannot bring outsiders here," Morrison said. "This is family business." Fleming nodded in agreement. "Some things are better left buried." Deputy Williams pressed them for more information, but both families became increasingly evasive. They claimed they had no knowledge of any graves on the property and insisted that my equipment must be malfunctioning. That night, I received a phone call at my motel. The voice was male but disguised, speaking in a whisper that made it impossible to identify. "Stop digging," the voice said. "Leave Harmony Ridge tomorrow and never come back. This is your only warning." I hung up and immediately called Deputy Williams. He promised to increase patrols around my motel and the surveying site, but I could tell he was taking the threat seriously. The next day, I returned to the disputed land with a different approach. Instead of focusing on boundary lines, I concentrated on documenting the underground anomalies. If these were illegal burial sites, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. As I worked, I noticed that both families were watching me from a distance. Morrison stood at the edge of his property with what looked like a rifle, while Fleming paced back and forth along his fence line. The tension was palpable, and I began to understand that I had stumbled into something far more serious than a property dispute. My breakthrough came when I decided to dig a small test hole at one of the radar anomaly sites. I had brought a folding shovel for exactly this purpose, and I chose a location that was roughly in the center of the disputed area. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that was definitely not soil or rock. I cleared away more dirt and exposed what was unmistakably human bone. A skull, partially preserved and stained dark brown from decades in the earth. But this was not an old burial. There were metal fragments mixed with the remains, pieces of what looked like contemporary clothing and personal effects. I could see a wristwatch, tarnished jewelry, and scraps of fabric that had not fully decomposed. I was looking at a murder victim, not an ancestor. I immediately called Deputy Williams and began photographing everything before disturbing the site further. But as I worked, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the forest. Morrison and Fleming had approached silently, and they were now standing about 20 feet away, watching me document their secret. Both men were armed, and their expressions made it clear that they viewed me as a threat to something much more important than property boundaries. "You should not have dug there," Morrison said quietly. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, still crouched beside the exposed grave. Fleming answered, 40 years, give or take. Maybe a few more. People pass through these mountains, drifters and travelers who nobody misses. Sometimes they cause problems, threaten families, steal from decent folks. "So you kill them," I said. "So we protect what is ours," Morrison corrected. "And we dispose of problems in a way that keeps our community safe." I realized that the property dispute had been a cover story for decades. The two families were not fighting over the land. They were cooperating to maintain it as a private burial ground for victims they could not afford to have discovered. "The surveying stops now," Fleming said, raising his rifle. "And you forget what you found here." Deputy Williams arrived 15 minutes later to find my equipment abandoned, but no sign of me. The test hole had been hastily filled, and both families claimed they had no idea where I had gone. It took search teams 3 days to find my body in a ravine 2 miles from the disputed property. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental fall while surveying remote terrain, despite the obvious evidence of violence. But I am still here in a way, still measuring and mapping the secrets buried in the hills around Harmony Ridge. And I know that someday, someone else will discover what the Morrison and Fleming families have been hiding in the land they never really fought over. The 44 graves are still there, waiting to tell their stories to anyone brave enough to dig deep enough to find the truth. I was supposed to fill in for the regular nurse in Riverside for just 2 weeks while she recovered from surgery. But what I discovered in that small Iowa town kept me awake for months after I finally escaped. Betty Sullivan is my name, and I have been a visiting nurse for 12 years, covering rural communities across the Midwest where medical professionals are scarce and help is always needed. I thought I had seen every kind of medical situation possible in isolated places. But Riverside taught me that some communities will go to unimaginable lengths to preserve what they consider their way of life. Riverside sits along a bend in the Cedar River, population 637, according to the faded welcome sign at the edge of town. The kind of place where cornfields stretch in every direction, where the biggest building is the grain elevator, and where 3 generations of families live within a few blocks of each other. It should have been a routine assignment. Cover the basic medical needs of a small community for 2 weeks, help with medication management for elderly residents, and assist the local doctor with whatever cases came up. Dr. Arthur Coleman had been Riverside's only physician for over 30 years, and everyone spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. He had delivered most of the younger generation, treated everything from farming accidents to heart attacks, and never turned away a patient, regardless of their ability to pay. When I arrived at his clinic on a Monday morning in September, he greeted me with the warm professionalism I had come to expect from small-town doctors. "Welcome to Riverside, Betty," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm despite his 70-plus years. "Martha Wilson will be back in 2 weeks, but until then, I am grateful for the help." The clinic was small but well-equipped, occupying a converted house on Main Street with examination rooms that had been added over the years as the practice grew. Dr. Coleman showed me around, introduced me to the receptionist and the part-time lab technician, and explained the filing system for patient records. "Most of our patients are families who have been coming here for decades," he explained as we walked through the facility. "You will find that Riverside folks are remarkably healthy for a rural community. We have very low rates of cancer, heart disease, and other chronic conditions that plague similar towns." That first week seemed to confirm his assessment. I saw patients for routine blood pressure checks, diabetes monitoring, and minor injuries. Everyone was friendly and seemed genuinely healthy for their age groups. But I began to notice patterns in the medical records that struck me as unusual. Every family in town seemed to share certain genetic traits that should have been much more rare. Unusual eye colors, distinctive facial structures, and physical characteristics that appeared with remarkable frequency across supposedly unrelated family lines. More concerning were the laboratory results I reviewed while organizing patient files. Blood work from residents showed genetic markers that I had never seen clustered together in such high concentrations. Not necessarily abnormal results, but unusual patterns that suggested these people shared far more genetic material than would be typical for a general population, even in an isolated rural community. "Dr. Coleman," I asked during one of our consultations, Have there been genetic studies done on the population here? Some of these lab results show interesting patterns. His reaction was immediate and defensive. Betty, I think you are reading too much into routine blood work. Small communities naturally develop certain shared characteristics over generations. But my nursing background included genetics training, and what I was seeing went far beyond normal population genetics. These people were not just distantly related through common ancestors. They were showing markers consistent with much closer genetic relationships than anyone was acknowledging. My suspicions deepened when I began reviewing the obstetric records from the past several decades. Dr. Coleman had delivered hundreds of babies over his career, but the birth records showed patterns that made no medical sense. Pregnancy complications that should have occurred regularly in any population were completely absent. Genetic disorders that should have appeared at predictable rates simply did not exist in Riverside. Either this community had the most extraordinary genetic luck in medical history, or something else was happening that was not reflected in the official records. I need to ask you about the fertility treatments, I said to Dr. Coleman at the end of my first week. He paused in his chart review. What fertility treatments? The medication inventory shows regular orders for reproductive hormones and genetic screening supplies that would typically be used for fertility interventions. But I do not see any corresponding patient records for these treatments. Dr. Coleman closed the chart he had been reviewing and looked at me with an expression that had shifted from friendly to calculating. Betty, you are a temporary employee here. Your job is to assist with routine patient care, not to audit medical practices. That evening, I drove through Riverside's residential neighborhoods, paying closer attention to the families I had been treating. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Children who supposedly belonged to different families showed striking physical similarities. Siblings who should have been years apart in age looked like twins, and adults who claimed no family relationship could have been identical relatives. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic early and used my access to the medical records to conduct a more thorough review. What I discovered made me physically ill. Dr. Coleman had not been practicing conventional medicine for decades. He had been conducting genetic experiments on the entire population of Riverside, using fertility treatments and selective breeding to create what amounted to a controlled human breeding program. The medical files contained detailed genetic analyses of every resident, tracking bloodlines and genetic markers with the precision of a livestock breeding operation. Families that claimed to be unrelated were actually carefully selected genetic matches. Pregnancies were not natural occurrences, but planned genetic combinations designed to reinforce desired traits. More horrifying were the records of unsuccessful outcomes. Children who did not meet genetic criteria were listed as stillbirths or infant deaths, but follow-up documentation suggested they had been removed from families and relocated elsewhere. The numbers were staggering. Over 30 years, hundreds of children had been born in Riverside, but only those who met Dr. Coleman's genetic standards had been allowed to remain. You should not have access to those files, Dr. Coleman said from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway of the records room. And for the first time since I had arrived in Riverside, he did not look like a kindly small-town doctor. He looked like a man who had been caught in the middle of something unforgivable. "What have you done to these people?" I whispered. "I have created perfection," he replied calmly. Riverside represents the future of human evolution. 3 generations of carefully controlled genetic selection, eliminating hereditary diseases and enhancing desirable traits. These people are healthier, more intelligent, and more physically capable than any normal population. They are your experiments, I said. You have been treating an entire town like laboratory animals. Dr. Coleman smiled. And now you understand why you are really here, Betty. Martha Wilson did not have surgery. She began asking the same questions you are asking, and she had to be removed from the situation. I realized with growing horror that my assignment to Riverside had not been random. I had been selected, evaluated, and brought here for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with providing medical care. You need new genetic material, I said. The breeding program is starting to show signs of inbreeding, and you need outside DNA to continue. You have excellent genetics, Betty. Healthy family history, high intelligence, and no chronic medical conditions. You would make valuable contributions to our community. I backed toward the clinic's rear exit, but Dr. Coleman moved to block my path. The people of Riverside have been very patient with your investigation, but now it is time for you to accept your role here. Through the window, I could see residents gathering in the street outside the clinic. Men, women, and children who I had been treating for the past week, all watching the building with expressions that were no longer friendly and welcoming. They knew what was happening inside, and they were there to ensure I did not leave. How long has this been going on? I asked, stalling while I looked for another exit. Since I arrived here in 1993, Dr. Coleman replied. Riverside was dying then, losing population and economic opportunities. I offered them a chance to become something special, something better than human. They embraced the vision. You mean they embraced the delusion? I corrected. These people are not evolved. They are victims of medical abuse on a scale that should be impossible in modern America. Dr. Coleman's expression hardened. They are the future, Betty. And you are going to help ensure that future continues. I broke the window behind me with a paperweight from the desk, climbed through, cutting my arms on the glass, but escaping into the alley behind the clinic. I could hear shouting from inside the building and the sound of people running toward my location. I made it to my car and drove out of Riverside faster than I had ever driven in my life, not stopping until I reached the state police barracks 50 miles away. But when the investigators arrived in Riverside the next day, they found a normal small town with a respected doctor who claimed he had never heard of Betty Sullivan. The medical records I had seen were gone. The genetic testing equipment had vanished. Even the blood samples that had shown unusual markers had been replaced with normal results. Dr. Coleman presented documentation showing that no visiting nurse had been assigned to his clinic, and the residents of Riverside supported his statements completely. The investigation was closed within a week due to lack of evidence. But I know what I saw in those files. I know what Dr. Coleman was doing to the people of Riverside, and I know that somewhere in Iowa, a genetic experiment is continuing under the guise of small-town medical care. The perfect community that never gets sick, never shows genetic disorders, and never questions why their doctor has been controlling their lives for over 30 years. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder about other small towns with beloved doctors and unusually healthy populations. I wonder how many rural communities have embraced similar visions of genetic perfection, and how many visitors like me have disappeared into experiments that continue in the shadows of American medicine. I came to Copper Hill to film their annual Harvest Festival, thinking it would be a charming, small-town tradition documentary that could help launch my independent filmmaking career. Arthur Phillips is my name, and I had spent 2 years researching unique American festivals when I discovered references to Copper Hill's 3-day celebration in obscure folklore journals. The descriptions made it sound like a perfect subject. An isolated Texas community that had maintained pre-industrial harvest traditions for over a century. I had no idea I was documenting the final phase of a ritual that had been consuming visitors for generations. Copper Hill sits in the East Texas piney woods, population 412, accessible only by a single winding road that branches off from a state highway and disappears into dense forest. The kind of place that exists on maps but feels forgotten by the modern world, where the cell phone service is spotty and the nearest interstate is 2 hours away. Perfect for a documentary about authentic American traditions that have survived in isolation. I arrived on a Thursday in late October, 2 days before the Harvest Festival was scheduled to begin. The town seemed frozen in time, with wooden storefronts that could have been built 50 years ago, and residents who moved with the unhurried pace of people who have never been in a rush to get anywhere. Everyone I met was friendly but guarded, willing to talk about the weather and local history, but evasive when I asked specific questions about the festival. "You will understand everything once it begins," Mayor Patricia Hendricks told me when I interviewed her at the town hall. Copper Hill's Harvest Festival is not like other celebrations. It is something that has to be experienced to be appreciated. I set up my equipment at the Copper Hill Inn, a converted Victorian house that served as the town's only lodging. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Coleman, seemed nervous about having a filmmaker in town during festival weekend. "Most visitors who come for the festival do not need accommodations," she explained while showing me to my room. "They usually become part of the community by the end of the 3 days." I assumed she meant that people enjoyed the festival so much they extended their stays or decided to move to Copper Hill. Small towns are always hoping to attract new residents, and a successful festival could be good for local economic development. The first day of the Harvest Festival began at dawn on Saturday, with what the residents called the Awakening Ceremony. The entire town gathered in the central square, forming concentric circles around a raised platform where Mayor Hendricks and several other community leaders stood wearing elaborate costumes that looked handmade and ancient. I filmed everything, focusing on the intricate details of the costumes and the solemn expressions of the participants. The ceremony involved chanting in what sounded like a mixture of languages, some recognizable as variants of English and Spanish, but others completely unfamiliar. The townspeople moved in synchronized patterns, stepping in rhythm to drums that were played by children who could not have been more than 10 years old. "This represents the awakening of the harvest spirit," explained James Morrison, a local teacher who had volunteered to be my guide. "Our ancestors brought these traditions from the old country, and we have maintained them without interruption for over 100 years. But as I filmed, I began to notice details that did not match Morrison's explanation. The costumes were not folk designs from any European tradition I could identify. The symbols carved into the wooden platform were not Celtic or Germanic, but something much older and more primitive. And the chanting, when I listened carefully through my headphones, contained words that sounded more like incantations than traditional folk songs. The second day involved what the residents called the binding ceremony. This time, the townspeople constructed elaborate displays throughout the business district, using corn stalks, pumpkins, and other harvest decorations to create intricate patterns that were visible from the second-story windows of the inn. From my elevated vantage point with my camera, I could see that the decorations were not random arrangements. They formed a complex geometric design that encompassed the entire downtown area, with the town square at the center and radiating patterns that extended to the edges of the commercial district. Each family contributes specific elements to the overall design, Morrison explained as we walked through the decorated streets. The pattern has been refined over generations, with each year adding new components while maintaining the essential structure. But the pattern I was documenting looked less like harvest decorations and more like some kind of containment circle, with symbols and arrangements that seemed designed to trap or control something rather than celebrate it. The geometric precision was far too exact for folk art, suggesting knowledge of mathematical principles that seemed out of place in a rural Texas community. On the second evening, I was invited to join the townspeople for what they called the Feast of Preparation. Long tables had been set up in the town square, loaded with food that had been prepared by various families throughout the day. Everyone in Copper Hill was present, from newborn babies to elderly residents who could barely walk. The food was unlike anything I had ever tasted. Rich, complex flavors that seemed familiar but impossible to identify. When I asked about the recipes, people would smile and give vague answers about family traditions and secret ingredients that had been passed down for generations. "You are eating the essence of Copper Hill," Mayor Hendricks told me as she refilled my plate. "Food that connects you to our community and our history." As the evening progressed, I began to feel strange. Not sick exactly, but altered in a way I could not describe. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds were more intense, and I felt a growing sense of connection to the people around me. Other visitors to the festival were experiencing similar effects, laughing and talking with residents as if they had known each other for years. The food helps newcomers understand what Copper Hill is really about, Morrison explained when I asked about the unusual sensations. It opens the mind to possibilities that might otherwise be rejected. That night, I reviewed the footage I had shot during the first 2 days of the festival. What I saw disturbed me more than I could rationally explain. When I watched the ceremonies through my camera, the participants looked different than they had appeared to my naked eye. Their movements were more mechanical, their expressions were blank and distant, and their costumes seemed to be made of materials that shifted and changed texture as I watched. More disturbing were the visitors like myself. In the footage, we appeared to be in various states of transformation, our faces becoming more similar to the residents and our movements becoming more synchronized with the group activities. I looked at my own reflection in the inn's mirror and saw subtle changes in my features that had not been there when I arrived. The third day was called the Harvest of Souls, and I woke up knowing that I needed to leave Copper Hill immediately. Whatever was happening during the festival was not a cultural tradition, but something far more sinister and supernatural. But when I tried to pack my equipment and check out of the inn, Mrs. Coleman informed me that leaving was not possible until the festival concluded. "The roads are closed during the final ceremony," she explained with a smile that no longer looked friendly. "Everyone who participates in the Harvest Festival must see it through to completion." I discovered that my car keys were missing from my room, and my cell phone had stopped working entirely. The other visitors who had arrived for the festival seemed unconcerned about these developments, apparently accepting that they would remain in Copper Hill for as long as necessary. The final ceremony began at sunset in the town square, with all the residents and visitors forming a massive circle around the decorated platform. Mayor Hendricks began chanting in the unknown language I had heard during the previous ceremonies, and the entire crowd responded in unison with words I somehow knew, despite never having heard them before. As the chanting continued, I began to understand what was really happening in Copper Hill. The Harvest Festival was not celebrating the agricultural harvest, but harvesting something else entirely: the identities, memories, and souls of visitors who were drawn to the community. The geometric patterns created with harvest decorations were not folk art, but a massive ritual circle designed to trap and transform anyone who participated in the 3-day ceremony. The food served during the feast of preparation contained substances that made visitors susceptible to the transformation process. And the final ceremony was designed to complete the harvest by absorbing newcomers into the collective consciousness of Copper Hill. I could feel my individual identity dissolving as the chanting reached a crescendo. My memories of life outside Copper Hill were fading, replaced by a sense of belonging to something ancient and hungry. The other visitors around me were undergoing the same transformation, their faces taking on the blank expressions I had seen in my camera footage. But some part of me, the part that had spent years behind a camera lens documenting reality, remained separate from the collective experience. While my body participated in the ritual, my consciousness retreated to a space where I could observe what was happening without being completely consumed by it. I watched as the festival concluded with all the visitors fully transformed into residents of Copper Hill, ready to help prepare for next year's celebration and the new harvest of souls it would bring. I saw myself smiling and shaking hands with Mayor Hendricks, accepting my permanent role in the community, while some deeper part of my mind screamed in helpless horror. The documentary I had intended to create was never completed, but the footage still exists somewhere in the collective memory of Copper Hill. Every year, during the Harvest Festival, that part of me that remains separate watches new filmmakers and researchers and curious visitors arrive in town, drawn by the same obscure references that had brought me here. And every year, I participate in their transformation while desperately hoping that one of them will prove strong enough to escape with the truth about what really happens when small towns maintain traditions that are older and hungrier than anyone wants to believe.